Welcome back, my friend, or perhaps welcome for the very first time. Either way, I am so glad tonight found you here. Wherever you are right now, there is something I love about this particular hour, that quiet, unhurried stretch between one day and the next, when the world finally gives you permission to simply be still. Tonight we're going somewhere extraordinary. Not overseas, not into deep space, not to the courts of ancient kings. We are going to the American frontier, to the raw, windswept heart of a nation still figuring out what it wanted to be. And we're going to follow the story of something so small, so humble, so utterly ordinary, that it quietly changed everything. A cup of coffee. Close your eyes for just a moment. It is 1875. The Texas sky has already surrendered to darkness, turning that deep inky blue that feels almost too wide to look at directly. And somewhere out on the open plain, somewhere between the last town you passed 3 days ago and the one you might reach in 4 more, a lone rider swings down from his horse. He's been in the saddle since before sunrise. His coat is caked with trail dust, the kind that works itself into the fabric and never fully washes out. His hands are calloused and cracked. His back aches in places he has stopped trying to name, and his eyes tired as they are moved with the quiet, practiced awareness of a man who has learned that the open land does not reward carelessness. He does not reach for a bottle. He does not say a prayer. He does not even take off his hat. He crouches down, strikes a single match against the heel of his boot, and begins to coax a small fire to life from a handful of dry grass and scattered timber. And then slowly, deliberately, he reaches into the worn leather saddlebag beside him and pulls out a small package. Brown paper, bold red and yellow lettering, and from the moment it hits his hands, even before he has torn it open, the smell rises, warm, deep, faintly sweet, completely unmistakably alive. It cuts straight through the cold prairie air like the only familiar thing left in the world. The cowboy tears the package open carefully, almost tenderly, and begins to work. In that moment, on that endless, wind-brushed grassland in the middle of what most people back east still considered the edge of the known world, a man makes himself a cup of coffee, and for the first time all day he exhales. Now, here is the question I want to carry with us tonight, the one I want to plant right at the centre of everything we are about to explore together. What was in that little package, and why did it matter so much? Why did this one small ritual, this humble paper bag of roasted beans, become the single most essential item on the American frontier, more trusted than a rifle, more desired than whiskey, more comforting in certain long and lonely hours than almost anything else a person could name? Because the story behind that package, the story of the family who made it, the problem they solved, and the empire they built in doing so, is one of the greatest, most forgotten business stories in the history of this country. And tonight we're going to tell it from the very beginning. But before we step into this story together, if something in you is already leaning forward, already curious, already feeling that pull, go ahead and give this video a like. It genuinely helps more than you might think. And if you want to tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're already tucked in with the lamp turned low, or sitting somewhere quiet with a warm drink in your hand, drop a comment below. I read every single one of those, and they mean more to me than I can easily say. If this kind of storytelling feels like something that belongs in your evenings, a subscription is the simplest thing in the world, and it ensures the next story finds its way to you. Now let us dim the lights down just a little further. Let us let the world go quiet. And let us begin. Here is something that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it. Coffee on the American frontier of the 1860s was not a luxury. It was not a comfort food, not a reward for a long day, not the kind of indulgence you allowed yourself on a slow Sunday morning when you had the time and the inclination. It was in the most literal, practical, serious sense of the word essential, as necessary as a fire on a cold night, as vital in its own way as water, and in certain long, grinding, bone-tired moments out on the open land, perhaps even more urgently needed. To understand why to truly feel it rather than just know it as a fact, you have to understand the world these people were living in. And that world begins, as so many American stories do, with the war. The Civil War ended in April of 1865. By that point, over 600,000 Americans had died. Not from starvation, not from illness alone, but from fighting each other. Neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. Across 4 years of a conflict that tore the country open at its deepest seam. Entire towns across the South had been gutted. Entire families had been broken apart in ways that did not fit into any category that people had a word for yet. And the men who came home from that war, and the many who chose or felt compelled not to go home at all, carried something heavier than exhaustion. They carried a world that no longer felt entirely familiar. So they moved westward. Because the West offered something that the wounded, uncertain East could not yet promise, a brutal, sprawling, wide-open kind of possibility. Land to be claimed. Cattle to be driven hundreds of miles across open grassland. New towns rising up from red clay and dry wind. And in all of that motion, all of that dust and distance and radical daily loneliness, there was one small ritual that held things together. The coffee pot over the fire. That ritual was not sentiment. It was not nostalgia, though it certainly carried some of that along with it. It was something more fundamental, the thing that said in the plainest possible terms, we're still here. The day has not won. Tomorrow is still worth reaching for. Here is a detail that gives you a real sense of just how seriously coffee was taken in this era. During the Civil War, the official United States Army ration for a Union soldier included 36 pounds of coffee per year. Per soldier. Per year. Not tea, which was considered more British, more civilized, and by 1865 deeply unfashionable. Not spirits, which President Andrew Jackson had actually removed from the military ration back in 1832, substituting coffee and sugar in their place because of the chaos that alcohol caused in the ranks. Coffee was the thing. The one irreplaceable thing. Civil War veteran John Billings, who served in the 10th Massachusetts Battery, wrote about it in his memoir years later with the kind of feeling you reserve for something that actually saved your life. He described how when the army halted on a march, even if only for an hour, rail fences in the area would immediately be dismantled for firewood. Not for warmth, not to cook food, to brew coffee. One young Union soldier, just 16 years old, wrote home describing his coffee one evening at dinner as something, and I want you to hear this, you probably would not recognize in New York. Boiled in an open kettle about the colour of a brownstone front, it was nevertheless the only warm thing we had. He was 16 years old, sleeping on the ground in enemy territory, and what he noticed, what he was grateful enough to write home about, was his cup of coffee. That tells you everything. And when the war ended, and all those men flooded west with the hopes and the traumas of 4 years of combat pressing at their backs, they brought that need with them. That daily, almost physical need for the one thing that had kept them human through the worst of it. Now here is where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean genuinely maddening in that specific way that makes you realize how much of daily life, for most of human history, has simply been people tolerating things that should have been fixed a very long time ago. The coffee these men and women were drinking on the frontier was, if we are being completely honest with each other, awful. Genuinely, consistently, frustratingly awful. Before the mid-1860s, coffee in America was sold green, raw, unroasted. You walked into a general store and the shopkeeper scooped raw green beans from an open barrel. They smelled of almost nothing. They looked like something you might find at the bottom of a grain sack. And then came the part that required both skill and luck in roughly equal measure. You had to roast them yourself, in a cast-iron skillet, over a wood stove or an open campfire, with no thermometer, no timer, no guide of any kind beyond your own memory and instinct. You stirred constantly. You watched the colour shift slowly, nervously from pale green to gold to brown, trying to hold that exact, narrow, unforgiving point between underdone and scorched. Too light, and the coffee tasted watery and raw, like something that had not quite decided yet whether it wanted to be food. Too dark, and the disaster arrived. One burned bean, just one, that was all it took. Because a single scorched bean in that skillet did not stay quietly in its corner and mind its own business. It spread the way a single drop of ink spreads through a glass of water, pushing its bitterness into every other bean in the pan until the entire batch was compromised. You could not pick it out. You could not balance it with anything. You started over, out on a cattle drive 200 miles from the nearest town, with 16 cowboys depending on your chuck wagon, and a schedule that could not afford delays. Starting over was not always a possibility you got to have. So people drank bad coffee, silently, grimly, daily, because bad coffee was still coffee, and coffee, even when it tasted like scorched ambition stirred into muddy water, was the something that made the morning survivable, and on the frontier survivable was enough. There is something quietly moving about that, I think. A certain stubborn, dignified refusal to give up on the one thing that made ordinary life feel worth showing up for, even when that thing kept falling short. Here is a detail that brings this picture into even sharper focus, and it is one that most people do not know. Long before covered wagons crossed the Missouri River, long before cattle drives and railroad towns and saloons with swinging doors, the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains had already developed a deep relationship with coffee, not through any inherited cultural tradition, not through centuries of farming or trade routes stretching back to the ancient world, but through exchange, through the simple, timeless human instinct toward anything that makes the cold feel a little less cold, and the morning feel a little more possible. Between 1833 and 1859, the American Fur Company traded regularly with Native American tribes across the plains, and among the items most eagerly, persistently sought in return for furs and hides, coffee beans. 1 cup of coffee beans for 1 buffalo robe. That was the going rate in those early years, and as word spread, as the taste moved from band to band across hundreds of miles of open grassland, that price actually increased. Eventually a single buffalo robe might fetch only 3 cups of beans. These were people with no ancestral memory of coffee, no grandmother who had learned to love it, no cultural story woven around it, and yet they were willing to trade one of their most valuable possessions, warm, carefully tanned, irreplaceable, to have it. That is not preference. That is something far more primal, a need that crossed every boundary, cultural, geographic, historical, and settled itself deep into the daily rhythm of life on the American frontier. Among every kind of person who called that land home, the West ran on this need, and the coffee meant to meet it was more days than not getting it spectacularly wrong. Now I want to introduce you to a family. Their last name was Arbuckle. John and Charles Arbuckle grew up in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, just across the river from Pittsburgh, a place that in the 1840s and 1850s smelled of iron and ambition in roughly equal parts. Their father, Thomas, was a Scottish immigrant, a practical man, the kind who ran a small cotton mill and a modest grocery and spice business without drama, and who raised his sons to understand that a problem was not something to endure, it was something to solve. John, the younger brother, the restless one, the one who would eventually become the most important figure in this story, was born in 1838 or 1839, depending on which record you trust from that era. He was from early on one of those quietly magnetic people who are impossible to ignore and nearly impossible to teach, because the classroom cannot quite keep pace with whatever is already happening inside their mind. He started college in 1856 at Washington and Jefferson College. He left within a year or two, not because he was struggling, not because the work was too hard, but because the real world, with its actual problems and its actual possibilities, simply seemed more interesting to him than sitting in a room being told about it. By 1860, he had joined Charles in the wholesale grocery business, and in the way that only the most genuinely observant people can, John Arbuckle began to really see something that everyone around him had simply accepted as the cost of doing business. Every single day, barrel after barrel of raw green coffee beans was scooped and sold to housewives, hotel keepers, restaurant cooks, traveling merchants, ranchers, farmers, to the entire churning human machinery of a country in motion. And every single day, every one of those people took those beans home and did their imperfect, anxious, potentially ruinous best, with a cast iron skillet over a fire. And every single day the result was a gamble. Then the Civil War arrived and interrupted everything the way that war does. John Arbuckle did his part. He was called up with the 15th Pennsylvania Militia Regiment in 1862 during the threat of Confederate invasion under Governor Curtin's emergency mobilization. He served 10 days with Company B, then was honorably discharged when the unit was stood down. In 1863 he served a 6-month term with the Independent Cavalry Battalion. He never once left the county he lived in. He was not a soldier by temperament. He was not built for the long, terrible patience that war demands. He was built for something else entirely, for that particular kind of restless, productive energy that wants to find the flaw in a system and pull it out by the roots. And when he returned to that grocery counter, back to those barrels of green beans and those customers who came in every week and left carrying a small, daily disappointment wrapped in brown paper, the question that had been quietly forming in the back of his mind finally became impossible to set aside. What if someone fixed this? Not incrementally, not a little, but truly fundamentally fixed it, in a way that changed the entire experience of what it meant to buy coffee in America. What if instead of handing people a raw product and wishing them luck with the most unforgiving step of the process, someone did the hard work in advance, roasted the beans properly, preserved the flavor, so it survived the journey from a Pittsburgh warehouse to a ranch kitchen in Texas, or a mining camp in Colorado, or a chuck wagon on the Chisholm Trail. Packaged everything in a way that delivered the same honest, reliable, satisfying result every single morning, regardless of who was holding the skillet or how tired they were or how inconsistent the fire. What if you gave people something they could actually trust? That question-patient, stubborn visionary was about to meet its answer, and the answer, when it came, arrived in a form that nobody would have predicted. Something small enough to hold in one hand. Something borrowed from a kitchen, not a laboratory. Something involving eggs and sugar and the surface of a roasted coffee bean. That discovery and the remarkable, restless, enormously ambitious man who made it is exactly where we are headed next. Because in just a moment we're going to step into the year 1865, the year the war ended and the country drew its first real breath in 4 years. And we're going to watch John Arbuckle take that stubborn, beautiful question and turn it into something the United States Patent Office had never seen before. Something that would eventually put his family's name on the saddlebags of every cowboy from Dodge City to the Rio Grande. Something that would make Arbuckle's a name from a Pittsburgh grocery counter, the most recognized brand in the American West. The breakthrough is coming, and I promise you it is worth staying right here for. Pittsburgh, 1865. The war has been over for less than a year. The country is exhaling slowly, carefully, the way you exhale after holding your breath for far too long. Cities are starting to feel like cities again. Families are beginning against all odds to reassemble themselves into something recognizable. And in the back rooms of a modest wholesale grocery on the south side of Allegheny City, a 26-year-old man named John Arbuckle is standing in front of a sack of roasted coffee beans, staring. Not in the distracted way most of us stare at things we're tired of looking at. In the focused, almost ferocious way a man stares at a lock he has not yet figured out how to open. Because there is a second problem with coffee. A problem that was just as ruinous as the burned bean disaster, but far quieter and far more insidious, and John Arbuckle had been turning it over in his mind for years. Freshly roasted coffee goes stale, fast. The moment heat transforms a raw green bean into something dark and aromatic and extraordinary, a clock begins ticking. The volatile oils responsible for everything you love about the smell and taste of good coffee, those oils do not stay put. They begin bleeding out into the surrounding air almost immediately. Within a matter of hours, the roasted beans you made this morning taste different from the ones you made last night. Within a week, the flavor is noticeably flatter, duller. Within 2 weeks, you're essentially drinking warm brown-colored disappointment. People living in cities could work around this. Buy small, buy often, roast frequently, keep the supply moving. But for everyone else, for the homesteader 3 days from the nearest general store for the cavalry unit, camped 50 miles from the nearest supply depot for the cattle drive pushing north through Kansas, with 16 mouths to feed, and no time to stop, the idea of buy small and roast often was a fantasy with no foothold in reality. So they did what people have always done when they have no better option. They adapted. They drank the coffee at whatever state of freshness or staleness it happened to be in. They lowered their expectations, and they stopped noticing because there was nothing to notice toward. And here is the thing about lowered expectations that I find quietly devastating. They have a way of becoming invisible. The worst version of a thing becomes the only version most people have ever known. And then when something better arrives, the reaction is not, "Oh, how nice." It is, "I had no idea it could be like this." That was the reaction Arbuckle was quietly engineering, even if he could not have put it in those exact words yet. Before I tell you about the discovery itself, I want to paint one more picture of what coffee actually looked like on the ground in that era, because I think it will make the solution feel as extraordinary as it genuinely was. Have you ever heard of the saucer and blow method? If not, and most people have not, this is how a significant portion of Americans drank their coffee in the mid-1800s. And it is one of those small historical details that tells you more about everyday life than 100 textbooks could. The process worked like this. You brewed your coffee, by which I mean you put a handful of roughly ground beans into a pot of water, brought the whole thing to a boil, and then waited for the grounds to sink. The key word there is waited, because the grounds did not always cooperate. Some of them sank, some of them floated. Some of them clung to the sides of the pot as if they had opinions about where they belonged. You then poured the coffee directly into a shallow saucer rather than a cup, because a saucer's wider surface allowed it to cool faster, and patience was not typically something the frontier had in abundance. Then you blew across the surface, partly to cool the liquid, partly, and this is the part that gets me every time, to try and blow the floating grounds out of the way before you attempted to drink. You then sipped directly from the saucer, carefully, systematically. With a technique that required genuine practice, a certain philosophical acceptance of whatever the morning decided to give you, and absolutely no dignity whatsoever. And yet, these were not people without standards. These were not people who did not care about quality. They were people who had never been offered better. That is a completely different thing. And John Arbuckle understood the difference instinctively. The experiments began quietly, the way most important things begin. No laboratory, no team of scientists, no grant from a university or a government agency. Just a man in a warehouse working with what he had, trying combinations that nobody had thought to try before, because nobody had thought the problem was worth solving. What Arbuckle was looking for was a way to coat the freshly roasted bean to seal its surface, the way wax seals a wheel of cheese or varnish seals a piece of fine furniture, so that the aromatic oil stayed inside rather than escaping into the air during shipping and storage. The coating had to be thin enough not to alter the taste of the coffee in any negative way. It had to be food safe, obviously. It had to dry quickly after application, so that bags could be packed without sticking together. And it had to be cheap enough to use at scale, because if this thing worked, it was going to work at a very large scale indeed. What he landed on, and I want you to sit with this for a moment because it is genuinely unexpected, was a mixture that reads more like a recipe from a Victorian kitchen than a formula from an industrial laboratory. Egg whites, sugar, Irish moss, isinglass, gelatin. Now, I suspect a few of those ingredients are already familiar to you, but isinglass, you may not have encountered isinglass before. It is a substance derived from the dried swim bladders of certain fish used for centuries as a clarifying agent in brewing and wine making. The idea that this particular material ended up as a key component in what would become the most popular coffee in the American West is one of those historical details that makes you want to stop and just appreciate how strange and wonderful the path of innovation can truly be. Mixed together in the right proportions, these ingredients created a glaze almost invisible, barely perceptible to the touch that coated each roasted bean in a thin protective film. In the words that would later appear on Arbuckle's own promotional materials, it closed the pores of the coffee and thereby retained all the original strength and aroma. The beans could now be packed into paper bags immediately after roasting. Those bags could be shipped across the country. They could sit in a general store for weeks. They could travel in a wooden crate on a railroad car through Arizona in August or Wyoming in February. And when that bag was finally torn open in a chuck wagon on the Chisholm Trail or a ranch kitchen in New Mexico, the coffee that came out smelled and tasted as though it had been roasted that morning. That was not a small thing. That was everything. The first patent came in 1865, protecting the general process of roasting and coating coffee beans for commercial sale. A more detailed patent followed in 1868, specifically covering the glaze formula, the exact combination of Irish moss, isinglass gelatin, sugar and eggs that Arbuckle had refined through years of quiet experimentation. Think for just a moment about the world in which these patents were filed. The same year as the first patent, the 13th Amendment was ratified, formally abolishing slavery. The same year as the second, the Transcontinental Railroad was still being built. It would not be completed for another year. The telephone would not be invented for 8 more years. The electric light bulb for 14. In the middle of all of that, becoming in the middle of a country rapidly and painfully reinventing itself, a man in Pittsburgh quietly patented the idea of reliable coffee. And history, which tends to reserve its monuments for generals and presidents, barely noticed. That, I think, is one of the more interesting things about innovation. The changes that most fundamentally alter daily life, the ones that reach into the kitchen and the camp and the morning routine of ordinary people, are rarely the ones that end up in the history books. They end up instead in the habits, in the expectations, in the quiet baseline of what people come to understand as simply normal. By around 1870, Arbuckle was selling his coated packaged coffee under a brand name that deserves a moment of its own attention. Ariosa, pronounced exactly as it looks, Ariosae. And the name, it turns out, was not chosen randomly or poetically. It was built from geography. The letter A stood for Arbuckle. The RIO in the middle was a reference to Brazil de Rio de Janeiro, which at the time was the beating heart of the global coffee trade. And the SA at the end stood for South America, the continent that provided the raw beans around which the entire enterprise was built. So every single package of Ariosa coffee was hidden in plain sight within its own name, a small geography lesson. A quiet acknowledgement of where the beans came from, and who was turning them into something worthy of the cup. That kind of intentionality strikes me as quietly remarkable. Most brand names of that era were essentially arbitrary. The owner's surname a made-up word, something that sounded vaguely distinguished. Arbuckle embedded actual meaning into his. He made the name itself a statement of provenance, of craft, of pride in the supply chain, which is a very modern idea for a man working in 1870. The package carried a label that people came to recognize on sight, a yellow background, the word Arbuckles, in bold red letters across the top, and beneath it the flying angel. A graceful figure rendered in the lithographic style of the era, hovering with calm authority above the brand name wings gently spread. One newspaper of the time, perhaps with a touch of gentle humour, noted that an angel was exactly the right figure to deliver coffee to a caffeine-needing populace. And honestly, they were not wrong. In an age before nutrition science and energy drinks and the entire modern vocabulary of performance and alertness, a reliable cup of freshly roasted coffee was about as close to a small daily miracle as most people on the frontier were going to encounter on a Tuesday morning. The packaging itself required solving an entirely separate engineering problem. Here is the truth that John Arbuckle understood earlier than almost anyone. A great product that you cannot produce at scale is a great idea, not a great business. The frontier was enormous. The demand, once word spread, was going to be enormous. What Arbuckle needed was not just a coating and a recipe. He needed a machine. He found his answer through collaboration working with an inventor named Henry Smizer of Philadelphia and a team of machinists to design a system unlike anything in the food industry at the time. The result was a machine that could take a flat sheet of glassine parchment paper, form it into a bag, fill that bag with a precise and consistent measure of coffee, seal it and produce the finished package all in one continuous automated operation. By 1879, as demand had grown far beyond what any manual process could keep pace with, the Brooklyn factory was running 10 dedicated machines for the ground coffee line and 12 more for the whole bean Ariosa. 22 machines running continuously, each producing hundreds of identical packages per hour. In an era when factory production was still in many industries a matter of individual workers performing individual tasks by hand, when consistency was a goal rather than a given, this was genuinely radical. Arbuckle had taken the human variable out of packaging. Every bag weighed the same. Every bag looked the same. Every bag promised the same thing and delivered it. That consistency, that quiet engineering miracle is actually at the heart of what made the brand so powerful. You would not have thought to name it as the reason you trusted the coffee, but it was there working on you every single time you opened a bag and found exactly what you expected. A brief, somewhat affectionate note about the crates, because I cannot let them pass without mention. The wooden crates that held the packages were not ordinary shipping containers. They were constructed from Maine, fur-strong, clean, tightly fitted boxes that held exactly 100 packages each, and that arrived at general stores and trading posts across the West, looking like they'd been built to outlast the journey. And outlast it they did. Because almost nobody threw these crates away. They became shelves in general stores, interior paneling in frontier homes, storage boxes, baby cradles. In a few grimly practical instances, coffins. They were dismantled for firewood when all other options had been exhausted. Navajo families in Arizona used the lumber from old Arbuckle crates to patch and repair their homes. The brand was so woven into the fabric of frontier daily life that even its packaging became part of the infrastructure of the West. People built things out of it. They lived alongside it and inside it. Arbuckle was not just shipping coffee. Whether he intended this or not, he was supplying raw material for the country. Vintage Arbuckle crates that survived intact are exceptionally rare today. When they do appear at auction, they sell for hundreds of dollars to collectors who understand exactly what they're holding. Not just a shipping container, but a small wooden chapter of American history. By 1873, 8 years after that first patient evening in a Pittsburgh warehouse, Ariosa had become something that no coffee had ever been in the United States. The first successful national brand of packaged coffee in American history. Not popular in one city, not dominant in one region. National. Carried by railroad to every corner of a country that was simultaneously becoming a coast-to-coast enterprise for the very first time. The timing was not coincidental. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed in 1869. And Arbuckle understood with the instinct of a genuinely gifted businessman that the infrastructure of distribution was just as important as the quality of the product. You can make the greatest coffee in the world. If you cannot get it to the people who need it in a form they can trust at the moment they are ready to buy it, you have a very enjoyable hobby, not a business. Arbuckle had the product, he had the patent, he had the machine, he had the packaging, and now riding the rails of a newly connected continent, he had the reach. What happened next, what those wooden crates and paper bags unleashed across the cattle drives and mining camps and ranch kitchens and frontier towns of the American West, is a story that belongs to a very specific kind of American character. The cowboy, the chuck wagon cook to be precise, a person who has never received nearly enough credit for the role they played in both the mythology and the daily reality of the West. A person whose morning routine, whose particular exacting, deeply personal relationship with that Ariosa package became the stuff of genuine frontier legend. That story is coming next. And if you've never heard of the ritual known as Who Wants the Candy, I can promise you are not going to forget it. Cookie was awake at 3 a.m. He always was. While the cowboys slept scattered across the dark Texas grass bedrolls, pulled tight hats, tilted low, and while the cattle breathed somewhere out in the black distance, Cookie was already moving, building a fire from last night's ash, hanging the pot, working with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of someone who has performed the same sequence of tasks so many times that it no longer requires thought, only presence. He was the chuck wagon cook. And if you want to understand what Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee actually meant to the American West, not as a business achievement, not as a patent or a packaging innovation, but as a daily lived irreplaceable human experience, you have to begin with him. The chuck wagon was invented in 1866 by a Texas rancher named Charles Goodnight, a man who would later be known as the father of the Texas Panhandle, but who in that particular year was simply a cattleman trying to solve the most persistent logistical problem on any long drive. How do you keep 15 hard-working men fed across 3 months of open country, with no towns, no supply lines, and no guarantee of what terrain the next day would bring? His solution was elegant in its practicality. He purchased an old army surplus Studebaker wagon, the kind of heavy, durable frame built to survive sustained punishment, and modified it. Steel axles to handle rough terrain, a large wooden cabinet mounted at the back, its hinged lid dropping down to form a flat working surface, its interior fitted with shelves, drawers and compartments, holding everything a trail crew needed. Flour, salt, dried beans, layered canned goods, where available medicine, sewing supplies, the cook's tools. He called the cabinet the chuck box. The wagon took its name from the English slang for food, hearty, practical, no-nonsense food that cowboys had already adopted as part of their working vocabulary. Goodnight's invention spread through the cattle industry with the speed of a genuinely good idea meeting an urgent universal need. By the time the great cattle drives were at their height in the 1870s and 1880s, no serious trail operation went into the field without one. Each night the cook's final task before sleep was to turn the wagon tongue northward, pointing it toward the direction of travel for the next morning, so the crew would know which way to head before the sun was even fully up. The chuck wagon was not just a kitchen, it was a compass. Cookie's place in the world of the cattle drive tends to get underestimated in the popular imagination, which has historically preferred to spend its time on the trail boss and the cowboys doing the riding. So let me correct that impression, because the reality is considerably more interesting. On a drive with 15 hands, the trail boss held final authority over everything related to the cattle and the route. His decisions about Pace River crossings, grazing stops and night watches were not to be argued with. For everything that concerned the daily welfare of the human beings doing the work, Their food, their health, their morale, their minor injuries, their arguments, and their overall will to continue Cookie was in charge. He was as the National Ranching Heritage Center at Texas Tech University, documented not merely a cook but simultaneously a barber, a dentist when necessary, a referee when tempers ran hot, and the crew's unofficial banker when paydays were still weeks away. He drove the wagon set up camp each evening ahead of the crew's arrival, and had hot food waiting when they got there. The compensation reflected this reality. While ordinary cowhands earned somewhere between $25 and $30 a month during the peak cattle drive era, a skilled cook commanded around $45 a premium that acknowledged how much harder it was to replace him than to replace any cowboy on the crew. The unwritten rules around his domain were understood and respected without need for instruction. You never tied your horse near the chuck wagon. Riders approaching camp stayed downwind so dust would not blow into the food. Nobody touched his cooking tools. Nobody helped themselves to food before he indicated it was ready. And there was one rule, small in its words but significant in its implications. If a cowboy refilled his coffee cup and someone called out, "Man at the pot," that cowboy was obligated to pour for every cup held out to him before attending to his own. Coffee on the trail was communal property. It was too important, too central to everything to be treated any other way. The Arbuckle's connection to all of this was by the late 1870s essentially structural. A cowboy named Ike Blazingame, who worked cattle across the Dakotas in the latter years of the 19th century, left behind a memoir that remains one of the cleaner first-hand accounts of trail and ranch life from that era. He described looking at the side of his outfit's chuck wagon and seeing bolted there at a working man's height a flat-sided coffee grinder always within reach, always ready. And inside the wagon, stacked in quantity, the familiar Arbuckle's packages, 1 pound each. Most outfits used the famous Arbuckle brand, he wrote, with the easy certainty of someone describing a fact so obvious it barely needed stating. Not one of the popular brands, not a reliable choice among several, just the brand. As though other options existed somewhere in the theoretical distance, but had not quite arrived at his particular location. By that point, something significant had happened to the word Arbuckles in the vocabulary of cattle country. It had completed the transition from brand name to common noun, a category descriptor. The way Stetson described a hat or Levi's described jeans regardless of who actually made the one you were wearing, Arbuckles. Described coffee, regardless of whether the particular bag in Cookie's hands was technically Ariosa or some theoretical competitor. On the drives you did not ask for coffee in the morning, you asked Cookie for your Arbuckles. Let me tell you about the ritual. Every morning, and I want you to picture this with some care because the detail is worth the effort, Cookie would prepare to grind the day's coffee. The grinder was bolted to the side of the wagon. Turning its handle was genuine work, not exhausting, but sustained and repetitive in a way that competes with 6 other tasks Cookie was simultaneously managing. And so instead of assigning the task or doing it himself, Cookie did something that was equal parts practical and quietly brilliant. He called out to the crew, "Who wants the candy?" Because inside every 1 pound package of Arbuckle's Ariosa tucked among the glazed coffee beans was a single stick of peppermint candy, sweet, cool. Individually yours in your hand right now, not baked into something communal, not dissolved into a drink, but a small, personal, immediate pleasure in a life that ran almost entirely on necessity and very little on sweetness. Have you ever been in a situation where a small comfort becomes disproportionately significant simply because everything around it is so stripped down, where something that would barely register in an ordinary week becomes in a harder context genuinely precious? That is what that peppermint stick was on the Chisholm Trail in 1878. And those those same men who'd been riding since before dawn, who'd crossed rivers on horseback without complaint, who regarded the performance of toughness as something close to a professional obligation. Those men competed for the chance to turn a coffee grinder. Enthusiastically, every single morning. There is something about that detail that I find genuinely wonderful every time I return to it. Not because it is funny, though it is a little, but because it reveals something true and tender underneath the mythology. These were human beings. They wanted the candy. And Arbuckles gave them a reason to want it and a small piece of kindness to reach for in the dark before sunrise. The coffee that resulted from that morning grind was brewed in large iron pots suspended over the fire. Cookie brought the water to a boil, added the freshly ground ariosa, and sometimes cracked a raw egg into the pot, the white binding with suspended grounds and clarifying the brew, pulling the particles down and leaving a cleaner cup. Cowboys drank it strong black and extremely hot. Trail accounts describe the preference as coffee, thick enough to float a horseshoe, which is the kind of description you produce when you've been awake since before the sky showed any colour, and you need something to happen to your brain immediately. The pot typically stayed on or near the fire all day. Passing hands helped themselves as shifts allowed, observing the man at the pot rule and pouring for others before themselves. By late in the afternoon, whatever remained was dense, concentrated and deeply caffeinated in a way that no reasonable person would voluntarily seek out unless they had a long night watch ahead of them, which most of them did. They drank it anyway, because it was Arbuckles. Because even reduced to its final, most concentrated form, it tasted like what it was supposed to taste like. In a life that offered very few of those guarantees, that was not a small thing. The Great Cattle Drive era ran from roughly 1867 to 1886. Roughly 5 to 10 million cattle moved north along the various trails. During those years, the Chisholm being the most travelled, running from South Texas through the Indian Territory and into Abilene, Kansas, where the railheads waited. At the height of the season, dozens of drives were in motion simultaneously. Each carried a chuck wagon. Each chuck wagon carried Arbuckles. In Dodge City, which processed hundreds of thousands of cattle each year at its peak, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, Arbuckles was the coffee you drank. In Tombstone, Arizona, where silver money was moving through the territory, and the streets were still being sorted out by a combination of law and improvisation, Arbuckles was the coffee you drank. The brand had followed the American West wherever the West went. It had become, in the truest and most complete sense of the phrase, the coffee that won the West. But here is what the cowboys did not know. What very few people anywhere in the country understood at this particular moment was that the company had been simultaneously building something else entirely. Something aimed not at cattle country, but at parlours, at kitchen tables, at the women who made the purchasing decisions in American households, and who had until now received very little attention from the people trying to sell them things. It involved small cards, printed in brilliant colours, and a loyalty system so sophisticated that its basic architecture is still running largely unchanged in almost every consumer rewards program in the world right now. That is the story coming up next, and I think it is going to genuinely surprise you. Somewhere around 1889, a woman in Pittsburgh or Cincinnati or Boston or Richmond, or any one of hundreds of American cities where Arbuckles had by now woven itself into the weekly shopping routine, opened a fresh bag of ariosa, reached her hand in among the sealed coffee beans and found something she was not expecting. Not just the familiar smell of a properly preserved roast, not just the peppermint stick which had by now become a known and anticipated pleasure. A card, about the size of a playing card, printed in colours that were by the standards of 1889 genuinely arresting rich yellows, deep greens, the specific warm red of ripe fruit rendered with obvious care and craft. On one side, a precise, beautiful illustration of cherries in full cluster, or plums at the moment of ripeness, or a spray of gooseberries, each piece of fruit painted with the attention of someone who understood that a small printed object has to earn its place in a person's home. She turned it over. On the back, a recipe for apple pie, one for Brown Betty, apple custard and apple jelly. And at the bottom of the card in neat type, this is number 47 of a series of 50. Others are available. Others are available. 3 words, a simple statement of fact. And yet those 3 words were arguably the most strategically potent sentence that any American company had written in the previous 20 years. John Arbuckle had been thinking about this for some time. The trading card was not his invention. Tobacco companies had been slipping illustrated cards into their products since the early 1870s, and a handful of food manufacturers had experimented with similar promotions. But what Arbuckle's built around the format was different in ambition, in scale, and in underlying sophistication from anything that had preceded it. The difference was not merely that Arbuckle's cards were prettier, though they were. It was that Arbuckle's had understood something about human psychology that its competitors had not yet articulated. People do not just want a thing. They want a complete set of things. The printing was contracted to Arbuckle Brothers, one of the most accomplished lithography firms in New York City. Their work was immediately distinguishable from the flimsy promotional inserts most companies produced. At the time, the colors held their saturation. The illustrations were accurate and detailed. The paper stock had weight. These were not objects you would throw away after glancing at them. They were objects that accumulated naturally on parlor tables and in kitchen drawers, sorted and handled and shown to neighbors and set aside with care. The subjects chosen for the various series were ambitious in a way that still impresses me when I sit down and consider the full scope of them. There were card sets depicting the flags and coats of arms of foreign nations, 50 to a series covering countries most American households had never encountered in any other format. There were zoological studies, birds, fish, insects rendered with scientific precision, sets devoted to sports and athletic pursuits, to domestic animals, to scenes of daily life from cultures around the world. Cards depicting every state in the Union, each printed with basic facts about population, industry, and geography. Cooking series, 50 cards per set, each one carrying a practical recipe on the reverse, written in a direct and helpful voice that treated the woman reading it as someone capable of managing a kitchen, rather than someone being talked down to about it. And history series. American history, world history scenes from famous events presented in the condensed visual format that made information accessible to people who might never read a formal history book, but who would absolutely pull a card from a drawer to show their children what a particular moment in time looked like. Do you see what Arbuckle's was actually doing here? The coffee company was positioning itself as a force for household education, for family enrichment, for the quiet expansion of what an ordinary American home could know and see and talk about. Every card was a reason to stop, look, learn something, and then look for the next one. Every series was a small curriculum that arrived one bag at a time in the kitchen. That is a profoundly different value proposition from our coffee tastes better than theirs. It is a value proposition that says buying from us makes your life more interesting. The psychology at work was something that behavioral economists would not begin to formally describe until a century later, but that Arbuckle's was already deploying with impressive precision in the 1880s. Human beings find incomplete sets deeply uncomfortable. Not distressing exactly, but persistently, quietly nagging. The 48 cards you already have are satisfying. Card number 49, once you know it exists, becomes the thing your mind returns to. And card 50, the last one, the one that completes the set, carries a disproportionate emotional weight that cannot be explained purely by its objective value, as a small piece of printed paper. Have you ever felt that particular pull, that slightly irrational but absolutely real discomfort of an almost complete collection? If you have ever saved loyalty stamps, collected anything that came packaged with a product you were already buying, or found yourself choosing one brand over another because you were close to a reward, you have felt exactly what Arbuckle's customers felt in 1889. The mechanism has not changed, only the product has. Before Pokemon cards, before McDonald's Monopoly game pieces, before airline miles and hotel points and Starbucks stars, before every subscribe and save program and collector's edition and limited run insert that any company has ever produced, a coffee company in Brooklyn built the model in the 1880s with lithographed cards about gooseberries and the flags of foreign nations. And then there were the coupons, not on the cards inside the bag, on the bag itself. Printed on the back of every Arbuckle's package was a small coupon worth 1 cent in redemption value. 1 cent was not much on its own, but 1 cent on every pound of coffee accumulated over the weeks and months of a household's regular consumption added up to something tangible, and the catalogue of what those accumulated cents could be exchanged for was carefully designed to appeal across a wide range of practical needs and quiet desires. Handkerchiefs, thimbles, needle sets, razors, the kind of good reliable razor that a man might appreciate but hesitate to purchase for himself at full price. Scissors, kitchen implements. At the higher end of the catalogue for the patient accumulator, with a significant supply order behind them, firearms, specifically rifles which in the West carried obvious practical value, and then the detail that I have never been able to read without stopping: a wedding ring. Redeemable with enough Arbuckle's coupons, a wedding ring. I genuinely cannot decide, even after thinking about it for longer than is probably reasonable, whether that is one of the most romantic things the 1890s produced, or one of the most audacious pieces of marketing strategy in American commercial history. The answer is almost certainly both, but it tells you something essential about what the Arbuckle brothers understood that their competitors did not. The person opening that bag of coffee every morning was not just a consumer. She was a person with a household to run, a family to provide for, a set of material needs that extended far beyond the pantry, and she was making purchasing decisions every single week that added up over time to real money and real choices. Give her a reason to consistently choose you and you do not have a customer. You have a relationship. This brings us to something that deserves direct acknowledgement, because it's often overlooked in histories that focus on the frontier and the cattle drive. Arbuckle's primary consumer in the domestic market that represented the largest share of coffee consumption in the country was a woman. In American households of the 1880s and 1890s, the person who managed the weekly shopping was in the vast majority of cases the woman of the house. She decided which flour to buy, which soap, which canned goods and coffee. She was the gatekeeper of the household budget and the primary arbiter of which companies earned her trust and which ones did not. Almost no one in American business was talking to her directly, not with practical educational content, not with household goods she could earn through ordinary shopping, not with a product story that made her feel like a discerning buyer rather than simply a person who needed coffee. Arbuckle's, perhaps without entirely realizing the significance of what it was doing, built a marketing system that treated the American housewife as an intelligent adult, capable of making consequential choices, and then gave her genuinely good reasons to make those choices in one particular direction. The food safety context of the era makes this even more meaningful than it might initially appear. Before the Federal Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906, the adulteration of food and drink in the United States was a common and largely unchecked practice. Coffee was a particularly tempting target. Roasted beans could be extended with chicory, which has a coffee-like bitterness, but lacks caffeine and most of the flavor, or with roasted grain, or with other cheaper substances that a buyer would not detect until she'd already brewed the pot. A woman named Carolyn French Benton, who wrote a household management guide in 1908 titled Living on a Little, advised young women setting up their first homes to never use cheap coffee. She was not making a statement about luxury. She was making a practical warning. Cheap unpackaged coffee from the barrel at the general store carried real risk in an era when no federal standard protected the buyer. A 1906 Ariosa advertisement addressed this, directly warning consumers to beware of the scoop, meaning the grocer's practice of scooping bulk coffee from open barrels and selling it by weight. The argument was simple. Who knew where that coffee had been? The packaged product, by contrast, bore a name, a trademark, a specific identifiable company behind every bag. If something was wrong, there was someone specific to hold responsible. For the women managing household budgets and family health, that accountability was not a minor reassurance. It was the kind of assurance that built loyalty over years that no price discount from a competitor could easily override. Step back for a moment and look at what Arbuckles had assembled by the early 1890s. A product that was reliably, consistently excellent. A distribution network reaching from Brooklyn to every general store on every cattle trail in the country. A brand identity so strong that its name had become a generic noun in the largest consumer market on the continent. A trade card program that engaged the collector's instinct and delivered genuine educational value to American families. A coupon system rewarding loyalty with tangible, practical goods from kitchen tools to wedding rings, and a marketing posture that addressed the primary purchasing decision-maker in American homes with respect, practicality, and genuine value. No one had built all of these things together before. Some companies had one or two of them. Arbuckles had the entire stack running simultaneously, reinforcing each other. What Arbuckles had built was, in the language of a century later, a complete consumer ecosystem, a closed loop of reasons to stay. And at the center of this ecosystem was a man who by the early 1890s had become one of the wealthiest individuals in the United States, a multi-millionaire whose Brooklyn operation was by most measures the largest coffee importing enterprise in the country, possibly at certain points in the world. His name, of course, was John Arbuckle, and the physical empire he had built on the Brooklyn waterfront, 12 blocks of industrial infrastructure, his own railway lines, his own ships, his own docks, was a monument to what a single, stubborn visionary, brilliantly restless mind could accomplish when it had the right idea at the right moment in the right country. What that empire looked like from the inside and what it felt like to be at the peak of something that large is the story waiting for us next. Because the view from the top of the Arbuckle Brothers operation in 1891 was extraordinary, and the view from the fall when it came was something else entirely. There is a phrase that appeared in at least one historical account of the Arbuckle Brothers complex at its operational peak, and I have been thinking about it ever since I first came across it. An industrial city by itself, not a large factory, not an impressive facility, not an operation to be admired, an industrial city by itself. The phrasing suggests something that exceeds the normal categories available to describe a business, something that has grown past the point where the usual vocabulary fits and requires its own terms. That is what John Arbuckle had built by the early 1890s on the Brooklyn waterfront, and I want to take you there. The neighborhood is called Dumbo. Down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, if you want the full name, a designation invented by local residents in the 1970s who were trying somewhat desperately to make an abandoned industrial zone sound interesting enough to live in. It worked. Today, Dumbo is one of the most photographed neighborhoods in New York City cobblestone streets, framing perfect views of the Manhattan Bridge luxury apartments, converted from old brick warehouses, tech startups on the upper floors, coffee shops on the ground level serving carefully sourced single-origin pour-overs to people who pay careful attention to their coffee. The irony of that last detail is not lost on me, because in 1891 those brick warehouses were not selling artisanal coffee, they were producing it, at a scale that the contemporary coffee industry, specialty roasters and all, would find genuinely difficult to contemplate. Step off the Fulton Ferry onto the Brooklyn waterfront on a working morning in the spring of 1891. You smell the operation before you see it. Roasted coffee, not the delicate, carefully calibrated kind that has become fashionable in the 21st century, but something industrial and enormous and alive rolling off the buildings and down toward the water. Underneath that, the mechanical heartbeat of machinery, the hiss of steam lines, the rhythmic percussion of the filling machines sealing hundreds of bags per hour, the deep rumble of a heavily loaded freight wagon navigating the waterfront cobblestones, and rising above it all the buildings themselves, brick massive, multiplying down the waterfront for what seems like an implausible distance. At the company's height, the Arbuckle Brothers complex occupied a dozen city blocks along the waterfront. 12 blocks of industrial Brooklyn real estate, all under a single ownership, all serving a single enterprise. What made the Arbuckle operation genuinely extraordinary, what separated it from any other large factory of the era, even the most impressive ones, was not simply its size. It was what the size contained. The business was, as one historical account put it, plainly completely self-contained. They did not outsource anything. The raw green coffee beans arrived from Brazil and other growing regions, carried on ships that the company owned or contracted exclusively. Those ships docked at Arbuckle's own waterfront facilities near the Empire Stores on Fulton Ferry. From there, the beans moved by Arbuckle's own private rail spur running directly through the complex to the roasting floor, where 85 ovens operated simultaneously, turning green beans into something dark and aromatic and ready. Then the coating process. Then the filling machines packaging the coated beans into the familiar 1-pound bags. Then labeling using artwork produced in the company's own large printing shop, which printed every label, every package, every advertising card, every piece of branded material that left the building. The finished bags were loaded into crates and onto wagons, and those wagons were pulled by horses kept in Arbuckle's own stables on the grounds. The woven sacks that the raw beans arrived in from overseas were washed and dried in Arbuckle's own laundry on site so that nothing went to waste and no outside vendor ever touched the process. When they needed shipping barrels, they made those too in an off-site barrel factory they also owned. And when workers on the factory floor needed medical attention, because this was heavy industrial work and accidents happened, they went to the company's own hospital. A hospital inside the coffee factory. I want to pause on that detail because I think it tends to slip past people without fully registering. John Arbuckle built a hospital inside his coffee operation, not because any law required it, not because it was standard practice in 1891, it was not, but because it was the logical extension of a man who had decided that if something needed to exist, he would build it himself rather than depend on anyone else to provide it. The factory also had a large airy dining room for employees. At a time when most industrial workers ate wherever they could find space, standing crouching outside in whatever weather the day offered, Arbuckle's workers had a room built specifically for the purpose of sitting down for a proper meal. That is a particular kind of character, and I do not think it was purely strategic, though it may have improved worker morale and retention. I think it was simply the way John Arbuckle thought, if it belongs in a good operation, put it in. The distribution network feeding from this complex extended across the continent with a precision that anticipates by about a century what modern logistics companies spend billions to achieve. By the early 20th century, Arbuckle Brothers maintained 400 distributing depots across the country, 400 locations spread across rail networks from the East Coast to the Pacific, ensuring that Ariosa reached every market that wanted it within a reasonable time frame. By 1906, the Brooklyn complex was roasting approximately 25 million pounds of coffee every single month. Let that number settle for a moment. 25 million pounds per month, 300 million pounds per year. From one company on one stretch of Brooklyn waterfront managed by one man who had started with a single roasting machine in Pittsburgh 40 years earlier. In the early 1900s, it is very likely that more coffee was roasted at the Arbuckle Brothers plant on John Street in Brooklyn than in any other building in the world. Not in the United States. In the world. His contemporaries called him the Coffee King, which is the kind of title that gets attached to people when the ordinary vocabulary of success has ceased to adequately describe what they have accomplished. In the landscape of the Gilded Age, that extraordinary decade and a half when American capitalism was producing concentrations of wealth and industrial power unlike anything the country had seen before or would see again in quite the same form, John Arbuckle was a figure of comparable magnitude to the names history has chosen to remember most prominently. Rockefeller had oil, Carnegie had steel, Vanderbilt had the railroads, Morgan had capital itself, the ability to assemble and direct the financial resources of an entire economy. Their names became synonymous with the era. Arbuckle had coffee. A smaller commodity, a more intimate one, something consumed not in the operations of industry, but in the daily private lives of ordinary Americans. And in that domain he had achieved a dominance that matched by the logic of percentage and market reach anything his more famous contemporaries managed in theirs. The difference, as far as I can determine from the historical record, is almost entirely a matter of personality. Rockefeller gave interviews. Carnegie endowed universities and wrote books about his philosophy of wealth. Their names were attached to buildings and charitable foundations that announced their legacy to anyone who walked past. They understood that a certain kind of public self-creation was part of the role. John Arbuckle did not announce himself. He gave almost no interviews. He was not photographed extensively. He did not seek the company of the social world that the Gilded Age created for its wealthiest inhabitants. He built expanded, refined, and went home to his relatively modest row house at 82 Willow Street in Brooklyn Heights, a man who could have lived anywhere in New York and who chose a quiet residential street, a short distance from his factory. A contemporary who worked alongside him for years described him as someone you could walk past on the street without a second glance. Not because he was unremarkable, but because he carried his authority in a way that did not require witnesses to validate it. There is something about that I find genuinely striking in an era when the display of success was practically a civic duty among men of his wealth. John Arbuckle seemed to have arrived at the conclusion early and without apparent struggle that the work was the point. The recognition was a byproduct he was willing to forgo. His personal life in the years at the peak of the empire had a texture that is worth knowing. He had married Mary Alice Kerr in Pittsburgh in 1868, the year his glaze patent was finalized, the year the business was becoming something more than merely promising. She moved with him through every expansion and relocation to New York and then to Brooklyn, where they eventually settled in Clinton Hill. In 1881, the same year the Brooklyn operation was being consolidated along the waterfront, John and Mary undertook something I find quietly touching. They went to court and legally adopted a child. The boy's name was Edward Nelson Green. He was 8 years old. His biological father signed over parental rights in exchange for $1, as the legal transaction of the era required. Edward took the name Arbuckle. Somewhere in the middle of building the largest coffee operation in the world, John Arbuckle found a boy who needed a home and gave him one. I mention this not as a footnote, but because I think it tells you something essential about who this man was underneath the patents and the machinery and the empire. The Coffee King was also a person who adopted a child in a Brooklyn courtroom, while simultaneously managing 400 distributing depots and 85 roasting ovens. Both of those things were true at once. That is, I think, how it usually works with the people history underestimates. If you walk through Dumbo today, and I genuinely recommend it, if you are ever in New York, you can still find the buildings. The brick walls of structures that were once part of the Arbuckle complex still line J Street and Plymouth Street. Some are offices now, some are residential. The former Arbuckle Brothers sugar refinery at 10 J Street, a 9 and 10-story building completed in 1897, has been converted into a contemporary workspace with 14-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass and a rooftop terrace with views of the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges. On the rooftop of what was once John Arbuckle's sugar factory, people now hold cocktail parties. And inside the building, the startups and design agencies and creative firms that rent the space probably have very good coffee sourced from small batch roasters who care deeply about their supply chain. I find that the past and the present are almost always in conversation if you know where to listen. The empire then was at its full expression in the early 1890s. 12 blocks, 85 ovens, 400 depots, a private dock, a private rail spur, a hospital, a laundry, a printing shop, a stable, a barrel factory, a dining room. Ships arriving from Brazil with raw beans, rail cars departing with £1 packages for every corner of a continent. A personal estate that would eventually total $33 million, and one man at the centre of it, private, practical, focused, and seemingly immune to the particular vanity that afflicted so many of his contemporaries. Then in 1891 something changed. Charles Arbuckle died. The elder brother, the man who had started everything, who had begun the wholesale grocery business in Pittsburgh in 1859, who had brought John into the firm, who had been John's partner for his entire professional life, died at their Brooklyn facility in the spring of that year. He was 58 years old. The circumstances of his final years were complicated in ways that history has treated, with varying degrees of gentleness, and which belong to a later chapter of this story. What matters for now is what the loss meant. John Arbuckle was alone at the top of an empire. He brought in his nephew William Arbuckle Jameson as a partner. He kept building. The operation continued to grow. But something had shifted, and the thing that came next, the confrontation that would define the second half of John Arbuckle's public life, was already approaching from across the harbour. Its name was the Havemeyer Sugar Company, and the man who ran it was Henry O. Havemeyer, known to his industry as the Sugar King. The Coffee King and the Sugar King, two of the most powerful businessmen in Gilded Age America. 1 mile of Brooklyn waterfront between them, and the largest private business conflict anyone in the country had ever seen about to erupt between them over a commodity that every American family bought every single week without a second thought. The story of how that war started and what it cost both men to fight it is waiting just ahead. And I promise you, it is the kind of story that explains why a century later, economists still use it as a case study in what happens when two giants decide to stop tolerating each other. Before there was Domino Sugar, there was Henry Havemeyer. If you've ever reached for that yellow bag in a grocery store, and most Americans have for most of their lives, then you have held in your hands the direct descendant of one of the most powerful industrial monopolies of the Gilded Age. The Domino brand was introduced in 1901, the same year the most expensive private business conflict in American history finally came to an end. The timing was not coincidental. It was a signal, a new name for a company that had just survived a war it had not expected to fight against an opponent it had not expected to take seriously. That opponent was John Arbuckle. And the war between them, 3 years of sustained mutually ruinous, nationally significant price cutting in two of the most fundamental commodities in the American household, deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Henry Osborne Havemeyer was born into the sugar business in 1847, the son of a dynasty that had been refining sugar in New York since before the Civil War. His grandfather had served 3 terms as mayor of New York City. His father had built one of the largest steam-powered refineries in Brooklyn. Sugar was not something Henry Havemeyer had chosen as an industry. It was something he had inherited and then transformed into something his predecessors would not quite have recognized. In 1887, he amalgamated 17 of America's 23 sugar refineries into a single entity, the American Sugar Refining Company. At its formation, it controlled 98% of all sugar refining capacity in the United States. 98%. King's Handbook of New York, published in that era, described it without apparent irony as, without doubt, the greatest and most important manufacturing industry in the United States. The press called it the Sugar Trust, a name that carried in the 1880s and 1890s the same combination of awe and unease that the word monopoly carries today. Those who covered it in financial circles took to calling Havemeyer the Sugar Pope, which is the sort of nickname that emerges when someone's market control has grown past the point where normal business language applies. He was not unaware of the legal vulnerability of his position. On June 12, 1894, Havemeyer testified before a special Senate committee investigating the Sugar Trust's practices. He admitted to lobbying on behalf of his company's interests, an admission he made with the particular composure of someone who does not think that what he is admitting constitutes a problem. When the senators requested his company's books for examination, he sought legal counsel, and then, at his next appearance, simply declined to submit them or to answer further questions. In 1897, he was tried for contempt of court for that refusal. He was found not guilty, and the case was dismissed. The Sugar Trust then went before the United States Supreme Court in the landmark case United States versus E.C. Knight Company in 1895 and won on the grounds that sugar refining was a manufacturing activity, not interstate commerce, and therefore beyond the reach of the federal government under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The government had taken its best shot at the Sugar Trust. The Sugar Trust had walked away. Henry Havemeyer was, as of the late 1890s, about as untouchable as any private businessman in America had ever been. He had survived a Senate investigation, a contempt charge, and a Supreme Court challenge, and emerged with his monopoly essentially intact and his composure entirely undisturbed. What he had not survived yet was John Arbuckle. The connection between the two men was for years entirely commercial and entirely peaceful. Arbuckle's egg and sugar glaze required a consistent high-quality supply of refined sugar in significant quantities, and the most convenient, most reliable source was the Havemeyer refinery in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, less than 2 miles from the Arbuckle complex on the waterfront. Arbuckle was by some accounts the single largest individual customer the American Sugar Refining Company had. The relationship suited both parties. Havemeyer got a dependable large-volume buyer. Arbuckle got the sugar his process required at terms that allowed his business to function profitably. At some point in the mid-1890s, Arbuckle did what any rational buyer would do when he represented a meaningful share of a supplier's revenue. He raised a question about pricing. The price of raw sugar on the global market had been falling, but the price that Havemeyer's company charged for refined sugar had not fallen commensurately. Arbuckle questioned this. He asked in essence why his costs were not reflecting the changing market reality. Havemeyer's response was not to explain or to negotiate or to acknowledge that his largest customer might have a reasonable point. He raised the price, not maintained it, raised it, in direct response to a question about whether it was fair. There is a kind of move that certain very powerful people make when they have operated without real competition For long enough they respond to challenge not with engagement, but with escalation, as a demonstration that the challenge itself was inappropriate. Havemeyer raised Arbuckle's price the way a feudal lord might respond to a tenant who dared to question the rent. As a lesson about who held the leverage, he had misjudged his man completely. In January 1897, John Arbuckle broke ground on a sugar refinery at 10 J Street in Dumbo, Brooklyn. He did not announce it as retaliation, or as a political statement, or as a mission to break up a monopoly. He announced it as a business decision. He needed reliable sugar at fair prices, and he was going to produce it himself. The building that rose on J Street over the next 2 years, 9 and 10 stories, steel frame, brick curtain walls, was simply in Arbuckle's framing a solution to a supply problem. That Havemeyer would experience it as a declaration of war was Havemeyer's interpretation, not Arbuckle's, though Arbuckle was almost certainly aware of the distinction. The announcement reached Williamsburg in the form that news always travels fastest newspaper coverage with all the detail and editorial commentary that newspapers of the 1890s devoted to major business developments. Havemeyer's response was swift, and to anyone who understood his character entirely predictable. He went into the coffee business. Specifically, he acquired controlling interest in the Woolson Spice Company, a coffee roasting operation in Toledo, Ohio. It was not a small company, but it was not Arbuckle Brothers either. It lacked Arbuckle's patents. It lacked Ariosa's 40 years of brand recognition in the American household. It lacked the distribution network that reached 400 depots across the continent. It had none of the institutional knowledge, the supply chain mastery, or the consumer trust that John Arbuckle had spent his professional life constructing. What it had was Havemeyer's money behind it. The plan was not subtle. Lower the price of Woolson Spice coffee below Arbuckle's price. Hold it there. Wait for Arbuckle to either match it and lose money, or hold his price and lose customers. Either outcome was acceptable to Havemeyer. Surely he calculated Arbuckle would eventually decide that the cost of the fight exceeded the value of winning it. He was wrong about that. Arbuckle's refinery began producing sugar in late 1898, and the moment it came online, the conflict that had previously been a coffee price war became a coffee and sugar price war simultaneously. Two of the most basic pantry items in America were now being sold below cost at the same time by two of the largest operations in their respective industries. And here is where the story takes a turn that genuinely impresses me, because Arbuckle did not fight the sugar war the way Havemeyer expected him to, instead of simply competing on price in the bulk sugar market where Havemeyer's vastly larger market share meant that any price cut would cost the American Sugar Refining Company far more money per unit. Arbuckle packaged his sugar in small individual portions. The same packaging genius that had transformed his coffee business 3 decades earlier, he now applied to sugar, a retail-ready product precisely measured, sold directly to consumers. Since Havemeyer sold primarily in bulk, he had no equivalent product. The small packages commanded a slightly higher per-unit price. Arbuckle's losses in sugar, while significant, were proportionally smaller than Havemeyer's. Meanwhile, Havemeyer was attempting to pressure wholesale grocers into refusing to carry Arbuckle's sugar, threatening to break his price maintenance agreements with anyone who cooperated with his rival. Arbuckle's response to that was characteristically direct. He bypassed the wholesalers entirely and sold straight to retailers. The retailers, who had not enjoyed being caught between two Gilded Age titans having a dispute on their doorstep, were generally happy to cooperate. The war was costing Havemeyer more than he had planned. And in 1900, something happened inside the American Sugar Refining Company that spoke volumes about the toll. F.O. Mathieson, one of Havemeyer's own directors, a man who had directed manufacturing operations since the company's formation, resigned his posts. The stated reason by those who covered the business press at the time was his bitter opposition to the continuing price war with Arbuckle Brothers. When one of your most trusted directors quits rather than continue, you have crossed from aggressive strategy into something that is simply burning money with no clear exit. The truce came in 1901. The terms were never publicly disclosed in full, as private commercial settlements of the era rarely were, but the outcome was legible enough. Havemeyer divested from the Woolson Spice Company and exited the coffee business. Arbuckle's sugar refinery continued to operate but did not pursue aggressive open market expansion. Both sides withdrew from 3 years of sustained below-cost selling in 2 commodity categories simultaneously. The combined losses across both companies by the estimates of the period somewhere in the range of $50 million. Some accounts attribute approximately $25 million to each side, and who won? The American Sugar Refining Company never fully recovered its previous dominance. Before the Arbuckle War even began, its market share had already fallen from 98% to 75%. The war accelerated that erosion. By the time Havemeyer died in December 1907, his company controlled only 49.3% of the sugar refining market in the United States. Half. The man who had controlled 98% of American sugar refining died holding barely half. Not because of government regulation, the Supreme Court had explicitly protected him from that. Not because of a better finance competitor emerging from within his industry. But because one coffee merchant from Pittsburgh, 6 decades into a career that had never once accepted a broken system without trying to fix it, decided that an unfair price was a problem worth solving, even if the solution cost $25 million. There is a contemporaneous account of Arbuckle's philosophy that I think captures something essential. He objected, it says, to organizations formed to obtain monopoly profits. He did not believe government interference was the solution. He preferred to call on his own abilities and finances to challenge monopoly control of a market. In other words, the correct response to a problem was to solve it yourself. The sugar war was not the only time he acted on this belief. Earlier in his career, he had challenged a towing monopoly that controlled traffic on the Erie Canal and successfully broken it. In 1901, as the Havemeyer conflict wound down, he turned his attention to the tugboat monopoly on the Hudson River, where a rate of $50 for a tow from New York City to Albany struck him as excessive and entered the market himself. Think about that pattern for a moment. Here is a man who by the late 1890s could have lived the remainder of his life in complete comfort. Instead, he spent $25 million defending the principle that a buyer who generates most of a supplier's revenue should not be punished for the privilege of asking a question about it. That stubbornness consistent lifelong applied to green coffee beans and freshness problems, and inefficient packaging and monopoly pricing with equal force was always the same impulse, the same man. 35 years richer and recognizably unchanged from the person who stood in a Pittsburgh warehouse in his mid-20s, staring at a problem everyone else had simply accepted. He was always going to build a refinery. Havemeyer just did not know it yet. The war was over. The empire held. And the 49-year-old Domino sugar brand in your kitchen cabinet was in its own quiet way a monument to what had happened between 2 buildings on the Brooklyn waterfront in 1897. But there is a dimension of this man that the business record for all its specificity does not fully capture. Because the coffee king, the man who fought the sugar trust to a draw and rebuilt the frontier's daily ritual from a Pittsburgh warehouse, was also doing something else entirely with his money and his attention. Something that had nothing to do with profit. Something done without fanfare, without plaque, and almost entirely without the knowledge of the people being helped. The Gilded Age had not quite seen it before. Because the people Arbuckle was trying to help were not the kind that typically received attention from men of his wealth. The man behind the Coffee King is the next thing we need to see. and I promise you, once you see it, everything about this story looks different. Every morning, John Arbuckle walked to work, from his home on Clinton Avenue in Brooklyn through the neighborhoods that the city's rapid growth had not yet made comfortable down to the waterfront, through, as one account of his habits puts it, the roustabouts and longshoremen on the riverfront. Past the men who loaded and unloaded ships, past the women who sold things from carts, past the particular texture of a working waterfront at 7 in the morning that has very little to do with the world that a man managing a 12-block industrial empire might be expected to inhabit. He did not take a carriage. He did not send ahead. He walked. And in that daily walk through the kind of city that most wealthy men of his era chose not to see too clearly, something was accumulating in John Arbuckle that was separate from the business decisions and the patent battles and the sugar wars, something that would eventually express itself in the most unexpected form imaginable. But before we get to that, I want to set the scene. Because the New York City that John Arbuckle was walking through around the turn of the 20th century was a place that requires some description to fully understand. By 1900, New York City held more than 3.5 million people, packed into a geography that had not been designed for anywhere near that number. The unification of the 5 boroughs in 1898 had created essentially overnight the second largest city in the world, and a very large proportion of those 3.5 million people lived in tenements, the dense, badly ventilated, frequently overcrowded brick buildings that lined street after street of Manhattan and Brooklyn, where multiple families shared a single toilet and a single hallway, where windows looked onto walls rather than sky, where the concept of private space was something you read about in magazines rather than experienced in your daily life. In the summer, these buildings became very nearly uninhabitable. The heat accumulated on upper floors with nowhere to go. The streets offered little relief because the streets were also packed, also hot, also thick with the particular combination of coal smoke and horse traffic and unwashed proximity that characterized urban poverty in that era. A tuberculosis epidemic was running through the poorest neighborhoods with an efficiency that public health officials found both alarming and difficult to address. The death rate in New York City in 1900 stood at 20% of the total population per year. 20%. Jacob Riis had documented these conditions in photographs 10 years earlier in his landmark 1890 book. The reading public had been shocked, and then, as reading publics frequently do, they had moved on. The men who had the resources to address the problem were for the most part addressing it in the way that the Gilded Age had prescribed. Andrew Carnegie was building libraries, more than 2,000 of them worldwide, each one carrying his name carved in stone above the entrance. John D. Rockefeller was endowing universities and medical research institutes. Both men believed that the correct approach to extraordinary wealth was to create structures permanent named architectural. The philanthropy of the era was essentially a form of monument building. John Arbuckle had spent enough time on the waterfront walk to develop a different point of view. His philosophy, as one historical account of his life describes it, was simple. Instead of donating money to charities, he took it upon himself to find solutions to societal ills. Not write a check, not endow a fund, find solutions himself. The distinction matters more than it might initially appear. A man who donates to an institution is to a significant degree done when the check clears. The institution takes the money, manages the program, absorbs the credit and the accountability. The donor's involvement ends at the transaction. A man who finds solutions himself stays involved. He makes decisions. He designs the thing. He walks past it on his morning commute and sees whether it is doing what he intended and adjusts if it is not. He is accountable in a direct and personal way for what the thing becomes. This was not a passive form of generosity. It was the same restless, direct problem-solving orientation that had driven every other decision John Arbuckle had ever made, applied now not to coffee beans or packaging machines or sugar refineries, but to the question of how to give exhausted working-class New Yorkers access to something most of them had never had: fresh air, open water, a night's sleep without the noise and the heat. His answer was a ship. Specifically, he took an old, dilapidated ex-packet ship, the kind of vessel that had outlived its commercial usefulness, and was waiting to be dismantled or sunk, and had it refitted and refurbished for human occupancy. Not luxurious occupancy, decent occupancy. The kind of accommodations that a working-class family or a tired office clerk or a longshoreman with a day off could actually afford and feel comfortable in. He called it the Deep Sea Hotel, and then more specifically the Jacob A. Stamler, a name that honoured people in Arbuckle's own orbit, rather than advertising the identity of the man paying for it. A 1906 advertisement for the Deep Sea Hotel Company describes what the Stamler offered with an earnestness that I find genuinely moving: accommodations for 100 guests with home-like cooking, comfortable and well-ventilated bedrooms, a reading room, a piano, daily newspapers and monthly magazines available for free use. No alcohol was permitted. A night watchman made frequent rounds after 10 in the evening to see if all is well. And the guests, the advertisement assured prospective visitors, comprised one large happy family enjoying all the conveniences of a modern hotel. The ship was moored at various points along the East River waterfront over the years. For a brief period it was anchored near the financial district, which produced one of the more delightful small episodes in the story. In July 1905, a group of Wall Street workers filed a formal complaint asserting that music from a steam calliope aboard the Stamler was disrupting their professional activities. Wall Street bankers filing a noise complaint against a floating hotel for poor workers. I've read this detail 3 times, and every time it makes me smile. Arbuckle's intent, as captured in an account of his motivations, was to give tired brain workers a chance to do a little yachting. Working-class New Yorkers, many of them immigrants, many of them working in the very industries that his own fortune rested on, stepping aboard a ship and feeling for a day or a week the kind of movement and fresh air that the city streets denied them completely. The thing is, it worked. The Stamler remained open and operating for years, and the photographs preserved in the Library of Congress show what it actually looked like. In use, the dining area, the people gathered around tables on the water. Real people, documented, not a concept, a thing that existed and functioned and helped. Arbuckle maintained in his Brooklyn office something that was unusual for a man of his stature: an open door to workers facing financial hardship and to outsiders who came hoping to gain his ear for charity. He listened. He made decisions in person. He carried the accountability himself. He kept a notebook, an open one, left on the table, and among the things written there was a Thomas Carlyle quotation that he had copied out by hand. Only workers with hand and brain are worthy of respect. All else is chaff and rubbish. He had also formulated somewhere along the way a maxim of his own. He expressed it more than once with the consistency of someone who has tested a belief against experience and found it reliable. Politeness is the cheapest commodity on God's earth. It costs nothing and will carry you farther and pleasanter through life than any other ticket you can travel on. These two ideas together tell you everything about how John Arbuckle understood the relationship between wealth and obligation. He had no patience for idleness, but he extended basic human dignity to every person he encountered regardless of their station. The longshoremen he walked past every morning were not scenery to him. They were workers, and workers deserved respect. The other centre of Arbuckle's private life, the place where his personal beliefs found their most formal expression, was Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights. Plymouth Congregational Church is by any measure one of the most historically significant religious institutions in American history. Founded in 1847, it rose to national prominence under its first pastor, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, a preacher of such extraordinary ability that people travelled from other states to hear him speak, and whose congregation filled a sanctuary built to seat 2,800. He was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had written Uncle Tom's Cabin. He shared his sister's convictions from a pulpit, rather than from a page holding mock slave auctions in his church to raise funds to purchase enslaved people's freedom and welcoming the Underground Railroad into Plymouth's walls, which earned the church the specific and meaningful nickname of Brooklyn's Grand Central Depot. Abraham Lincoln attended services at Plymouth Church in February 1860, the week before delivering his Cooper Union address, the speech that effectively launched his presidential campaign. This was the community John Arbuckle chose to be part of. He joined Plymouth Church in the 1880s during Beecher's final years of ministry, and by all accounts the pastor's theology left a permanent mark. Beecher preached a gospel of love, not the predestinarian Calvinism of his father's generation, but a Christianity centered on the idea that God's fundamental character was love, and that the correct human response was active, outward-facing care for the people around you. You can see Beecher's influence in almost every significant decision Arbuckle made outside of business. The floating hotel, the open office door, the daily walk past the waterfront workers, the quietly extended courtesies to people who could offer him nothing in return. After Beecher died in 1887, the church launched a major expansion program. A new community center was built designed to offer services and activities to Brooklyn Heights residents, providing classes from accounting to physical education, hosting concerts, social events, programs that reached the neighborhood around the church rather than simply the congregation within it. That building was initially called the Arbuckle Institute, not a grand hall bearing his name on a university campus. A community building serving working people named for a man who walked to work every morning and kept his office door open and put a piano on a floating hotel so that exhausted New Yorkers could hear music on the water. The building was later renamed Plymouth Institute and then Plymouth Church House. The name of its benefactor did not survive the renaming, which is in its own way entirely consistent with how John Arbuckle had conducted every other private dimension of his life. I want to ask you something directly. Think about Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Arbuckle, three of the most powerful businessmen of the Gilded Age, three men who turned significant attention toward what extraordinary wealth could be used for beyond the accumulation of more of it. Carnegie's libraries are still open. Rockefeller's universities are still among the finest research institutions in the world. These are genuine and lasting contributions, and I do not want to diminish them. But Arbuckle's approach, direct, personal, solution-focused, name-optional, addressed the people who most urgently needed addressing. The workers, the immigrants, the families in the tenements, who could not afford a library membership or a university education or any connection to the institutions that the other two men were funding. He built a ship that a longshoreman could sleep on for a week, and he put a piano on it, and he asked nobody to thank him for it. Carnegie's name is on 2,000 buildings. Arbuckle's name was on one community center in Brooklyn, and then that name was quietly changed. Which of those men understood something more important? I'm honestly not sure I know the answer, but I am fairly certain the question is worth sitting with. The Gilded Age was coming to an end. Not dramatically, not with a single event, but in the slow and unmistakable way that eras always end by being gradually replaced by something different. The frontier that had first carried Ariosa's yellow label west on railroad cars was already closed. The great cattle drives had ended 20 years before. The cities were changing, the consumers were changing, and the landscape of American commerce was shifting in ways that a company built around one man's genius would find increasingly difficult to navigate. New technologies were appearing in the coffee industry, new competitors with new ideas about how to preserve roasted beans, and inside the Arbuckle family itself, something that had gone unspoken for some years was about to become impossible to ignore any longer. The story of how the empire handled what came next and what the death of Charles Arbuckle had concealed until this moment is not a comfortable story. It is the kind of story that every great enterprise eventually produces when the first generation passes and what they built has to be carried by people who did not build it. That story begins with Charles, and it is considerably more complicated than anything we've touched on so far. Every empire has a co-founder that history forgets to mention. We have spent a great deal of time with John Arbuckle in this story, and for good reason. The patents bear his name, the philanthropy bears his fingerprints, the public record of decisions and inventions and battles fought is overwhelmingly his. But the company was never John's alone. It was John and Charles, two brothers from Allegheny City building something together for more than 30 years. And Charles Arbuckle, the elder of the two, has been almost entirely erased from the story that history chose to tell. I think that deserves correcting. Even briefly, even imperfectly, given how little the historical record preserved about him. Because what happened to Charles Arbuckle in the final year of his life is one of the strangest, saddest, most genuinely human episodes in this entire saga, and it is a story that almost nobody who drinks coffee today has ever heard. Charles Arbuckle was born in 1833, 6 years before his younger brother John. He was the one who in 1859 first organized the wholesale grocery partnership in Pittsburgh that would eventually grow into a coffee empire, working alongside their uncle Duncan MacDonald and a family friend named William Roseberg, under the original name MacDonald and Arbuckle. It was Charles who brought John into the business in 1860, when John was barely out of his teens and had just abandoned his brief unsatisfying attempt at college. For the next 3 decades, the brothers operated in a kind of complementary partnership that by most accounts worked extremely well. John was the visionary, the patent holder, the man who stared at a sack of coffee beans until he found a way to fix it, the restless engine of product innovation and expansion. Charles was something different, the operational backbone. He personally supervised the roasting floor. He managed logistics. He was, by the description of those who worked alongside him, a master businessman and a shrewd negotiator, the kind of partner whose contributions are essential precisely because they are unglamorous. Charles never married. That detail on its own is unremarkable. Plenty of 19th century businessmen remained bachelors by choice or circumstance and built lives around their work instead. But in Charles's case, it sets up something that the historical record only recently brought fully into focus, and that I think changes how we should understand his final chapter. In 1891, as Charles Arbuckle's health was failing and his life was approaching its end, a deeply uncomfortable story broke into public view. A woman named Clara Campbell took Charles Arbuckle to court, the charge breach of promise to marry. The claim laid out in the proceedings was that Charles had courted her, had promised marriage, and had then changed his mind while she was travelling out of the country, leaving her by the standards of the era in a position of significant social and personal damage. A breach of promise lawsuit in the late 19th century was not a minor matter. It was a recognised legal claim taken seriously by courts because a broken engagement carried real consequences for a woman's reputation and prospects, in a world where marriage was treated as one of life's most consequential transactions. The case became public. Letters were apparently introduced as evidence, private correspondence between Charles and Clara, read aloud, or entered into a courtroom record exposed to whatever combination of newspaper coverage and social gossip 1891 New York offered. Clara Campbell won her case, and Charles Arbuckle, according to the account that survives, handled the loss with what one source describes somewhat dryly as expected maturity, a phrasing that suggests he did not handle it particularly well at all. He died not long afterward in 1891 in Brooklyn. I want to sit with this for a moment because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Here was a man who had spent 30 years building one of the largest industrial enterprises in the country. A man whose careful, unglamorous management of a roasting floor had been just as essential to Arbuckle Brothers' success as his younger brother's patents and marketing genius. A man who by every external measure had achieved a level of wealth and accomplishment that most people in any era could not imagine. And in his final year, what the public record chose to preserve about him was not the company. It was the lawsuit, the broken promise, the private correspondence read aloud in a Brooklyn courtroom. There is something quietly devastating about that, about how thoroughly a single difficult chapter can come to overshadow everything else a person built. We tend to imagine that history remembers achievement and forgets failure, but sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes the scandal survives in the record with far more clarity than the decades of competent, essential, unglamorous work that came before it. Have you ever known someone like that? Someone whose one visible misstep became unfairly the thing people remembered, while years of quiet contribution simply faded from the conversation? I think Charles Arbuckle deserves better than to be remembered primarily for a breach of promise lawsuit. He deserves to be remembered as the brother who, alongside John, built something that outlasted both of them by more than a century. Charles's death left John alone at the top of an empire that the two of them had built together, and it forced a transition that every family business eventually faces whether the founders are ready for it or not. John brought in his nephew William Arbuckle Jameson as a partner, along with two other trusted long-time employees. The company continued operating under the Arbuckle Brothers name, even though there was strictly speaking only one Arbuckle brother left running it. And interestingly, that same year, 1891, the year Charles died, the brothers' company made an unexpected purchase that had nothing to do with coffee or sugar at all. They bought a cattle ranch in Wyoming. The P.O. Ranch, located north of Cheyenne, was purchased from a prominent territorial politician and rancher. Neither John nor Charles had any particular Western ties. Both had been raised in Pittsburgh and had spent their adult lives in New York City. The exact reasoning behind the purchase is not entirely clear in the historical record, though one detail seems almost too fitting to be coincidental. The two men whose coffee had become the single most trusted brand among cattle drovers and cowboys across the American West, now in their final years together as a partnership, owned a piece of that West themselves. John would occasionally visit the ranch and friends in nearby Cheyenne. In the years that followed, though, he never built a permanent home there, unlike many wealthy cattlemen of the era who maintained residences in the territorial capital. It is a small, strange footnote to the larger story, but I find it oddly moving that the company whose name had been carried on saddlebags across 1,000 miles of frontier grassland ended up almost by accident owning a literal piece of that frontier. Now alone at the head of the company, John Arbuckle turned a significant amount of his remaining energy toward a cause that connects directly back to the very problem that had launched his career in the first place, the question of what exactly people were actually buying when they purchased food. In 1901, a food and dairy inspector in Toledo, Ohio, named Edward Beverstock, brought a legal charge against a retailer selling Arbuckle's coffee, alleging that the egg and sugar glaze that had made Ariosa famous violated Ohio's new pure food law on the theory that it artificially increased the weight of an inferior product. The case went to trial. The government's chief witness was Harvey W. Wiley, the chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture, a man who would go on to become one of the most consequential figures in the entire American pure food movement, eventually leading the charge that produced the Federal Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. The jury found Arbuckle's company guilty, but the appeals court reversed the conviction, ruling that the original jury had been improperly selected, closely associated in fact with the claimant and his son, which raised serious questions about the trial's fairness in the first place. There has long been suspicion among historians who have studied this episode that Henry Havemeyer, still smarting from the Sugar War that was raging during these very same years, may have had some quiet involvement in stirring up the legal trouble. What happened next tells you something important about John Arbuckle's character. He did not treat Harvey Wiley as an enemy for testifying against him. He befriended him. The two men became genuine collaborators in the broader pure food movement. Arbuckle, who understood the coffee adulteration problem more intimately than almost anyone alive, established an independent sugar testing laboratory to monitor and verify the quality of sugar circulating in the American market. Think about what that means for a moment. A businessman who had just been put on trial over allegations of product impurity responded not by attacking the regulatory framework, not by lobbying against pure food legislation, the way many of his Gilded Age contemporaries did, but by building his own independent testing infrastructure and partnering with the government's chief food scientist. That is not the behavior of a man trying to get away with something. That is the behavior of a man who actually believed in the principle and wanted to see it enforced correctly, even against companies that happened to be his own. There is one more detail from this period of John Arbuckle's life that I cannot resist sharing, because it reveals a side of him that the patent battles and the sugar wars do not capture at all. On July 9, 1889, the United States Patent Office issued John Arbuckle an official patent not for anything related to coffee, for a mitten. Specifically a mitten with a small hole positioned at the thumb through which the wearer could blow warm breath in order to keep their hands warmer in cold weather. I want you to picture this for a moment, a man who by 1889 controlled the largest coffee importing operation in the United States, who had fought legal battles over food purity, who would soon take on one of the wealthiest industrialists in America in a multi-million-dollar sugar war, sitting somewhere on some cold day, thinking about his own hands and deciding that the solution was a mitten you could breathe into. Unlike his coffee packaging innovations, which permanently reshaped an entire industry, the breathing mitten does not appear to have caught on. But I find that patent strangely endearing. It tells you that this was a man whose mind simply did not stop noticing problems. Cold hands were a problem. So he solved it, patented the solution, and moved on to the next thing. The same restless, practical problem-solving instinct that built an empire also apparently produced a slightly unusual mitten. Not every idea changes the world. Some ideas just keep your thumb warm, and I think there is something worth admiring in a person who treats both kinds of problems with the same level of genuine attention. By the early 1900s, John Arbuckle was approaching his mid-60s. He had survived his brother by more than a decade and counting. He had fought and effectively won a war against one of the most powerful monopolists in American history. He had built hospitals and floating hotels and retirement communities. He had befriended the government scientist who once testified against his own company. He had in nearly every respect lived several distinct and remarkable lives within the span of one ordinary human lifetime. But empires built around a single extraordinary individual face a particular kind of vulnerability, one that has nothing to do with competitors' lawsuits or market conditions. They face the question of what happens after that individual is gone. John Arbuckle's own health, as it happened, was about to begin its final decline. And the company he and his brother had spent more than 4 decades building was about to enter the most difficult chapter of its entire existence, a chapter shaped not by a rival businessman or a government investigation, but by something far more ordinary and far harder to fight. Time, that story, the long, slow ending of a company that had once been the single most trusted name in American coffee, is where we are headed next. And I think you will find it is one of the more quietly moving parts of this entire history. In 1903, the New York Times ran a small item that if you were skimming the business pages that morning you might have read past without a second thought. John Arbuckle had purchased 282 acres of farmland in New Paltz, a quiet farming town roughly 80 miles north of New York City, nestled against the Shawangunk Ridge. $12,000, a modest transaction by the standards of a man whose company was roasting 25 million pounds of coffee a month. It would have looked on paper like a wealthy man buying a country retreat, a place to escape the city, the kind of purchase that wealthy industrialists of the era made constantly building estates and hunting lodges and seaside cottages where they could retreat from the demands of empire. That is not at all what John Arbuckle had in mind. Over the following years, Arbuckle kept buying the Deo Farm, the Helena Smear's property, 6 more parcels after that. By the time he was finished, his holdings in New Paltz had grown to more than 1,200 acres, an almost incomprehensible expanse of land for a coffee merchant from Brooklyn to be quietly assembling in the rolling farm country of the Hudson Valley. And the purpose, once it became clear, was entirely characteristic of the man we have spent this whole story getting to know. This was never meant to be a private retreat. It was meant to be a working vacation colony, a place where exhausted city labourers, the same kind of tired brain workers he had once tried to refresh, aboard a floating hotel on the East River, could come for a genuine change of scenery, fresh air, useful work and rest. Arbuckle's underlying philosophy, as one account of the project records it directly in his own words, was this: everyone is better physically and mentally who earns their own living, because they are made to feel they are of some use in the world. He did not want to simply give people a vacation. He wanted to give them purpose alongside their rest. The land had a golf course, lawn tennis courts, and access to the Wallkill River for fishing and boating with the boats themselves provided by Arbuckle. Twice a month, 40 underprivileged children from the city were brought up to New Paltz for a 2-week stay complete with fresh air, proper meals, and outdoor exercise that their tenement neighborhoods could never offer them. He even offered a $100 prize, a meaningful sum at the time, to anyone who could submit the best idea for making the colony more genuinely rewarding for the people who would stay there. He was not simply building a charity, he was actively soliciting better ideas for how to run it well, the same way he had once welcomed challenges to his own business practices. He also constructed something specifically for workers with disabilities, an industrial home where they could learn a trade and earn a genuine living built around a structure called the Colony Building. According to the records that survive, it was an enormous building, 287 feet long, 80 feet wide, 4 stories tall. Just as construction was nearing completion, it burned. I want to pause on that because it is the kind of detail that easily disappears in a list of accomplishments, and I think it deserves a moment of genuine weight. Imagine the years of planning, the land assembled parcel by parcel, the architectural vision for a building specifically designed to give disabled workers dignity and a trade and a livelihood. And then just before it could open its doors to a single person who needed it, fire. The historical record does not tell us how Arbuckle personally responded to that loss, whether he rebuilt or what became of the project afterward. Some stories, even ones we go looking for specifically because we want to understand a person, fully simply trail off into silence where the documentation runs out. That silence is in its own way honest. Not every effort that a person makes resolves into a satisfying ending. Sometimes you build something good and it burns and the record simply does not tell you what happened next. What survives clearly, though, is the intention. And the intention tells you once again exactly who John Arbuckle was. At the core, a man who looked at people the world had decided to overlook, underprivileged children, workers with disabilities, exhausted labourers with no means of rest, and built them something specific, something tailored to their actual situation, something considerably more thoughtful than a cheque written to a general charitable fund. As Arbuckle moved into his 70s, one final battle remained, and it was in certain respects the most personally revealing fight of his entire career. In the early 1910s, the United States government maintained protective tariffs on imported sugar, designed primarily to shield the domestic sugar beet industry from foreign competition. Arbuckle, who by this point had spent more than a decade as one of the largest sugar importers and refiners in the country, understood the economics of that tariff with a clarity that few others in public life possessed. And he hated it, not because it cost his own company money, although it certainly did. He framed his objection in terms that had nothing to do with his own balance sheet. The tariff, he argued, benefited a narrow set of sugar beet growers at the direct expense of every single American household. Sugar was a commodity used by rich and poor alike, he pointed out, but the burden of an artificially inflated price fell hardest on the people who could least afford it. He put it in a phrase that has stuck with me ever since I first encountered it, because it carries exactly the kind of plain, unpretentious moral clarity that characterized everything else about him. Like taking candy from babies, that was how John Arbuckle described a sugar tariff in the final public campaign of his life. Not an abstract economic injustice, not a violation of free trade principle, though he certainly understood the principle. A government quite literally taking candy from babies, because that is what an inflated sugar price actually meant in the kitchens and pantries of ordinary American families. In 1911, he announced his intention to fight the duties as soon as his health allowed it. His health did not allow it. For many years by this point, John Arbuckle had suffered from malaria, a disease that in the era before effective anti-malarial treatment produced recurring cycles of fever chills and profound physical exhaustion that could incapacitate even the most determined person for extended stretches. Where and when he contracted it is not entirely clear from the historical record. What is clear is that it had been with him for years, returning in waves, draining the energy of a man who had never in any other context allowed anything to slow him down. The same restless engine that had stared down a sack of green coffee beans in 1865, that had built a hospital inside a factory, that had taken on the most powerful sugar monopolist in American history, and effectively broken his stranglehold on the market. That engine was finally running up against something it could not outthink or outbuild or outstubborn. His condition worsened through 1911 and into the early months of 1912. On March 27, 1912, John Arbuckle died at his home in Brooklyn. He was 73 years old. The Literary Digest, one of the most widely read general interest magazines in America at the time, published a retrospective on his life just over 2 weeks later, under a headline that captured in 5 words the entire arc of what we have spent this story exploring together. How Arbuckle beat the trusts. That was how the country at the moment of his death chose to remember him. Not primarily as a coffee merchant, not even as a humanitarian, though that dimension of his life was widely known by 1912. As the man who had taken on a monopoly and won using nothing but his own business acumen, his own capital, and his own stubborn refusal to accept an unfair price. He was buried at Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh beside his wife Mary Alice, who had died 15 years earlier in 1897. 2 Scottish immigrants' children, he from a cotton mill family, she the daughter of a former Pittsburgh mayor, laid to rest together in the city where their story and the story of an entire industry had originally begun. His estate was valued at $33 million. At a time when the dollar was tied to gold and federal income tax did not yet exist, that levy would not arrive until the following year. In 1913, this represented a genuinely staggering accumulation of private wealth built across 52 years, starting from a wholesale grocery counter in Allegheny City. I find myself thinking at this point in the story about something the Times article from 1903 could not have known it was documenting. That small, unremarkable item about a coffee merchant buying farmland in New Peltz was actually one of the final chapters of a man's lifelong consistent answer to a question that very few people with his level of wealth ever genuinely ask themselves. Not, how do I protect what I have built? Not, how do I ensure my name survives? The question John Arbuckle seemed to ask again and again across 50 years and a dozen different ventures. What does this specific group of people right in front of me actually need? And how do I build that directly with my own hands and my own resources, rather than simply writing a check and walking away? Underprivileged children needed 2 weeks of fresh air. He built a colony for them. Workers with disabilities needed dignified employment. He designed a building specifically for that purpose, even though it burned before it could open. Tired city laborers needed rest. He gave them a ship. American families needed fair sugar prices. He fought the tariff with the same words a child might use taking candy from babies. That consistency applied to coffee beans, to sugar prices, to floating hotels, to farmland in the Hudson Valley, right up to his final public statement before his health finally failed him, is, I think, the truest measure of who this man actually was. But here is the question that has to follow any story like this one, and it is the question we have not yet answered. What happens to an empire built this completely around the instincts, the values, and the relentless personal attention of one single man, once that man is no longer there to walk to work every morning? John Arbuckle had built something extraordinary. 12 city blocks of industrial Brooklyn, 400 distribution depots, a brand that had become a generic noun for coffee itself across an entire continent, a personal fortune that placed him among the wealthiest individuals in American history. And on March 27, 1912, all of it passed into other hands, hands that had not stood in that Pittsburgh warehouse in 1865 staring at a sack of green coffee beans, refusing to accept that this was simply how things had to be. What those hands did with the empire they inherited, and how completely, how almost unimaginably the story of Arbuckle's coffee would eventually fade from American memory is the story I want to tell you next. Because the ending of this story is not what you might expect. There is a particular kind of tragedy that only happens to people and companies who have already proven they know exactly what to do. Not the tragedy of ignorance, not a company that failed because it never understood its market. This is something stranger, and I think considerably sadder, a company that demonstrated conclusively with hard evidence and real money that it understood precisely how to win in the modern world, and then simply chose not to apply that lesson to the one place it mattered most. That is the story of what happened to Arbuckle Brothers in the years after John Arbuckle's death, and it begins somewhat surprisingly with a triumph. In the summer of 1913, a little over a year after John Arbuckle had died, the company's new leadership made a decision that would have seemed entirely foreign to the founder himself. They hired an advertising agency. Specifically, J. Walter Thompson, already, by 1913, one of the most sophisticated advertising firms in the country, the kind of agency that was beginning to professionalize what had previously been a fairly amateur industry of slogans and broadsides into something approaching a genuine science of persuasion. The product they were hired to promote was not Ariosa. It was something new, a premium blend that had originally been John Arbuckle's own personal coffee, the specific selection of the finest South American beans that he reserved for his own Christmas dinner table and gave as gifts to friends during the holiday season. The company called it the Yuletide Banquet. J. Walter Thompson's team, led by an advertising executive named Stanley Resor, approached the project with genuine care. They debated the name extensively. The Arbuckle leadership initially suggested something straightforward, like Arbuckle's Christmas Coffee or Arbuckle's Guest Coffee, but Resor and his colleagues pushed back. Too generic, they argued. It would not wear well over time. And besides, they pointed out something that must have stung slightly to hear out loud. Relatively few customers actually ask for coffee by the name Ariosa anymore. Because the coupons inside every package were signed Arbuckle Brothers, most ordinary shoppers had simply started calling the whole product line Arbuckle's full stop. The careful brand architecture that had once distinguished Ariosa as a specific named product had over decades dissolved into a generic catch-all. The new premium blend needed its own distinct identity untethered from that drift. They landed on a name that sounded faintly aristocratic, slightly mysterious, memorable in a way that a generic descriptor never could be Yuban. Likely an invented word, though the company would later suggest it was simply a contraction of Yuletide Banquet. The campaign that followed was, by the standards of 1913 consumer advertising, genuinely ambitious. Arbuckle approved an advertising budget of $74,000 for the New York metropolitan market alone newspaper advertisements, billboards positioned along commuter rail lines, signage in subway stations. Over Thanksgiving week, full double-page advertisements ran simultaneously in 12 newspapers across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The positioning was precise and deliberately exclusive. Yuban was marketed as the private coffee of the greatest coffee merchants, the blend formerly reserved exclusively for personal and gift use, now for the first time available to the ordinary American household. The advertisements promised the choicest, most delicious cup of coffee, which can be secured regardless of cost. One advertisement depicted elegant women in ostrich feather hats, gathered around a dining table, captioned with the suggestion that any hostess's guests would immediately recognize the quality of what they were being served. 25 trained salesmen fanned out across the metropolitan region to introduce the new brand to grocers directly. The retail price was set at 35 cents per pound, positioned deliberately to match what customers already expected to pay for high-quality bulk coffee, removing any psychological barrier to trying something new. Within 10 weeks, Yuban was outselling every other packaged coffee brand in New York City. By February of 1914, a follow-up advertisement was boasting that more than 5,000 grocers across the metropolitan area now stocked it. The campaign was, by any reasonable measure available to a company in 1914, an unambiguous total success. So here is the question I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is the entire tragedy of this chapter, compressed into a single observation. If the company had just proven conclusively with real sales data from real grocers that a properly funded, professionally executed, nationally minded advertising campaign could take a coffee blend from obscurity to market leadership in 10 weeks, why did Arbuckle Brothers never apply that lesson to the brand that actually mattered most? Why did Ariosa, the coffee that had won the West, the coffee that had built the entire empire, the brand whose flying angel had once flown over every chuck wagon from Dodge City to the Rio Grande, never receive anything resembling the Yuban treatment? The 1920s arrived. Prohibition took hold across the United States in 1920, and as alcohol disappeared from American social life, coffee experienced something close to a renaissance. Coffee houses proliferated in cities across the country. An entire generation of Americans, suddenly deprived of one familiar social ritual, found a replacement in another. It was by almost any measure the single best decade for coffee consumption that the American market had ever produced. And the coffee companies that understood how to seize that moment did exactly what Arbuckle had just demonstrated it knew how to do with Euban. Maxwell House began pouring money into national advertising throughout the decade, spending figures that climbed from under $20,000 in the early 1920s to nearly $300,000 by the middle of the decade. By 1925, consumer surveys identified Maxwell House as the single most recognized coffee brand name in America. Hills Brothers built its own national reputation around a genuine technical innovation vacuum, sealing introduced commercially in 1900 and refined over the following decades, which solved the same freshness problem that Arbuckle's egg and sugar glaze had originally solved in 1865, but through an entirely different and ultimately more durable method. Arbuckle Brothers, meanwhile, simply refused to mount a comparable national campaign for its core brand. Not because the company lacked the money. The empire was still vast, still profitable, still occupying 12 blocks of Brooklyn waterfront. The refusal appears to have been as much as anything else, a matter of institutional inertia, a company that had built its original dominance on product innovation and word-of-mouth reputation among cowboys and homesteaders decades earlier, and that simply never internalized the lesson its own Euban campaign had just demonstrated with such force that brand reputation built in one era does not automatically transfer into the next one. It has to be actively, continuously, expensively maintained. Have you ever watched an organization do this, prove to itself with clear and undeniable evidence that a particular approach works, and then fail to apply that same approach anywhere else, simply because the old way of doing things still felt on some institutional level like the correct way? I think this happens more often than we acknowledge in companies and in individual lives alike. We learn a lesson in one specific context and somehow fail to generalize it. We discover that something works, celebrate the result, and then quietly return to our previous habits in every other part of our life where that same lesson would apply equally well. Arbuckle Brothers had in Euban built an almost perfect case study in modern brand marketing. And then it let Ariosa, the actual foundation of everything the company had ever achieved, fade slowly into irrelevance simply by declining to tell its story to a new generation of American coffee drinkers who had never ridden a cattle drive, never heard the words, "Who wants the candy?" and had no inherited reason to reach for that particular yellow and red package over any other. The slide through the 1920s was gradual rather than dramatic, the kind of decline that is almost impossible to notice from inside an organization, because every individual year looks roughly similar to the year before it, even as the cumulative trend moves steadily in one direction. Then the Depression arrived in 1929, and gradual decline became something more urgent, facing the same economic pressure that crushed thousands of American businesses in that decade. The Arbuckle family, by this point 2 generations removed from John, and Charles, managed by descendants and inherited partners, rather than the founders, themselves began selling off pieces of the empire. The one asset they held onto for as long as they reasonably could was Euban, the brand that had once proven so emphatically exactly what the company was capable of when it actually tried. One by one, the great Brooklyn factories closed. The roasting operations that had once produced 25 million pounds of coffee a month went silent. By 1935, what remained of Arbuckle Brothers was absorbed into Maxwell House, which would itself shortly become part of the larger General Foods Corporation. The Euban name survived the transition. General Foods recognized real value in a brand that had once outsold every competitor in New York within 10 weeks of its launch. Ariosa, the coffee that had actually won the West, simply did not. The physical buildings outlived the company by decades, though their purposes shifted entirely away from coffee. The sugar refinery on J Street operated under various owners until 1945, when it was repurposed as a whiskey warehouse, a strange, almost poetic footnote given that John Arbuckle's floating hotels had strictly forbidden alcohol on principle. Other portions of the complex eventually became storage space for the Abraham and Straus department store chain. Today walk through Dumbo, and you will find creative agencies, technology startups, and luxury apartments occupying the brick shells of buildings that once roasted more coffee than any other structure on the planet. I want to be careful here not to overstate the lesson, because I think the temptation towards simple moral arithmetic is strong, and the truth is somewhat more layered than they should have advertised more. Coffee as a product category was genuinely difficult to market nationally in this era, for reasons that had nothing to do with corporate willpower. Freshly roasted coffee staled quickly, the very problem John Arbuckle had originally solved with his glaze in 1865, which made aggressive, far-reaching national campaigns logistically complicated in ways that other consumer products of the 1920s like soap or soda simply did not face. A handful of visionary companies solved this distribution puzzle through technical innovation like vacuum sealing, combined with serious advertising investment. Arbuckle Brothers had once been exactly that kind of visionary company. It built the technical innovation that solved the freshness problem for an entire generation. It simply never updated that innovation and never matched the advertising investment that its competitors were making. The deeper lesson, I think, is not really about advertising budgets at all. It is about what happens to an organization's identity once the founder who built it, through sheer restless personal attention, is no longer there to provide that attention. John Arbuckle never stopped looking for the next problem to solve. He solved coffee freshness in 1865, packaging consistency in the 1870s, brand loyalty in the 1880s, monopoly pricing in the 1890s and 1900s, urban poverty and elder care and disabled worker training across 4 decades of parallel humanitarian effort. Every single one of those projects represented the same underlying habit. Notice what is broken and fix it yourself immediately, rather than waiting for circumstances to force your hand. The Euban campaign of 1913 and 1914 proved that the people running Arbuckle Brothers after John's death still understood on some level exactly what that kind of restless attention could accomplish. They simply never turned that attention back toward the company's own foundation. And so, by 1935, a company that had once been the single most trusted name in American coffee, a brand carried in saddlebags across the entire western frontier, a name that had genuinely become a generic word for coffee itself in the vocabulary of an entire region, simply ceased to exist as an independent entity. Most Americans alive today have never heard the name Arbuckles. Ask someone on the street about Maxwell House and they will likely recognize it instantly. Ask about Folgers or Hills Brothers or Euban itself, still quietly sold on supermarket shelves. Today, as an unremarkable mid-tier brand, most people will know at least one of those names. Ask about Arbuckle's, the company that arguably invented the entire concept of packaged, branded, nationally trusted coffee, and you will mostly receive blank stares. That is not how this story was supposed to end. And the truth is, in a sense, it does not quite end there. Because somewhere in the deserts of Arizona, decades after the last Brooklyn factory went silent, something rather remarkable was about to happen to that little flying angel. That is exactly where I want to take you next. 1974, a Pennsylvania couple named Pat and Denny Willis had a problem that had absolutely nothing to do with coffee history, brand legacies, or the American frontier. They owned restaurants, and like restaurant owners everywhere in every era, they were tired of inconsistent suppliers. They wanted a coffee they could rely on, something with a steady, dependable quality that would taste the same in every cup, served to every customer every single morning, without the kind of variation that makes a restaurant owner's life unnecessarily complicated. So they decided to roast their own. It was, in other words, a startlingly ordinary problem with a startlingly ordinary solution. Two people who ran restaurants got frustrated with their coffee supply chain and figured they could probably do it better themselves. There was no grand vision yet, no sense that they were about to become custodians of a piece of 19th century American history. Just two restaurateurs who wanted a decent, consistent cup of coffee for their customers. As part of building out this small roasting operation, the Willises hired a salesman. His name was Ken Arbuckle, and according to the accounts that survive from those early years, Ken claimed something that immediately caught Denny Willis's attention, that he was a descendant of the original Arbuckle Brothers family, the Pittsburgh coffee dynasty, whose name, decades after the Brooklyn factories had gone dark, was still faintly recognizable to anyone who had grown up around old cowboy stories or read about the cattle drives of the American West. Whether Ken Arbuckle's claimed lineage could be definitively verified is honestly somewhat beside the point of what happened next. What matters is that his name and the conversation it sparked sent Denny Willis down a research path he had not expected to travel. He started learning about the original company, about John and Charles, about the egg and sugar glaze, the chuck wagons, the peppermint, Styx the flying angel that had once flown over Dodge City and Tombstone, and 1,000 other frontier towns whose names most Americans had long since forgotten. And somewhere in that research, Denny Willis discovered something that struck him as genuinely remarkable: the Arbuckle trademark, the Flying Angel. The name, the entire branded identity of what had once been the most dominant coffee company in the United States had lapsed, expired, unclaimed, sitting in the public record like an artifact nobody had bothered to put behind glass. After more than 3 decades, the most recognized coffee brand on the entire American frontier had become, legally speaking, available to anyone willing to do the paperwork. Have you ever stumbled across something valuable simply because nobody else had bothered to notice it was still there for the taking? That is, in essence, what happened to Denny Willis in the mid-1970s. He registered the Arbuckle trademark. He began developing a coffee roasting operation under the Arbuckle name, and as his research into the company's history deepened, as he learned more about exactly what had made the original product so beloved across the frontier, he made a decision that I find genuinely moving in its specificity. He decided to bring back Ariosa, not just a coffee company called Arbuckle selling whatever blend happened to be convenient. The actual historic flagship, the coffee that had been carried in chuck wagons across the Chisholm Trail, the coffee that John Arbuckle had spent his entire career perfecting packaging and defending against monopolists twice its size, and he included the peppermint stick, tucked inside every 1-pound bag exactly as it had been done since the 1870s. A small deliberate act of historical fidelity from a man who clearly understood that the candy was never just candy. It was the connective tissue between a modern customer and a chuck wagon cook calling out, "Who wants the candy?" across a Texas campsite more than a century earlier. In 1979, the Willis family relocated their growing operation to Tucson, Arizona, a landscape that in its own way felt considerably closer to the spirit of the original frontier brand than Pennsylvania ever could. Open desert, cattle country, historically speaking not too far removed in feeling from the plains where Ariosa had first made its name. For years, the revived Arbuckles operated as what was essentially a regional southwestern brand. Local stores in the Tucson area carried it. People who remembered the name from their grandparents or who simply appreciated good coffee with an interesting story attached to it became loyal repeat customers. It was a small, dedicated, slowly growing business, nothing close to the 12-block industrial empire that had once dominated Brooklyn's waterfront, but a genuine functioning continuation of something that history had otherwise allowed to disappear. Then in 2002 the company launched a website, and something shifted. E-commerce did for Arbuckles in the early 21st century something resembling what the railroad had done for Ariosa. In the 1870s, it broke the company free of geography. A coffee that had spent nearly 30 years as a beloved but essentially local Arizona product suddenly became available to anyone anywhere in the country with an internet connection and a credit card. Today, the company ships Arbuckle's Ariosa to customers in all 50 states and to international buyers well beyond American borders. The Tucson roasting and packaging facility still maintains a small retail storefront for local customers, but the overwhelming majority of the business now travels through exactly the kind of distribution channel that John Arbuckle, with his obsessive instinct for solving logistics problems, would almost certainly have appreciated, even if the underlying technology would have been entirely beyond his comprehension. Denny and Pat Willis have since passed away. Their son, Josh Willis, now runs the operation, roasting by current figures well over 100,000 pounds of coffee every year. A genuine fraction of the 25 million pounds a month that the original Brooklyn complex once processed at its absolute peak, but a fraction that exists at all only because two restaurant owners in Pennsylvania once got frustrated with an unreliable supplier and happened to hire a salesman with an interesting last name. There is one more thread to this revival story that I want to share with you because I think it captures something profound about how history actually gets preserved, not through grand institutions necessarily, but through individual people who simply decide that a particular story deserves to survive. In 1994, a writer and university professor in El Paso named Francis L. Fugate published a book devoted entirely to the history of Arbuckle's coffee, the definitive scholarly account of John and Charles Arbuckle, the patents, the cattle drives, the sugar war, all of it assembled with the kind of careful archival research that takes years to complete properly. It would be his final work. Fugate died sitting at his own desk in front of his computer, in the process of putting the finishing touches on the manuscript. By the account of those who knew him, among the last words he typed were lines from an old cowboy song, a piece of frontier verse about the particular satisfaction of a good meal and a fire, after a long day driving cattle, the kind of simple weathered sentiment that the cowboys who once depended on Arbuckle's coffee would have understood instinctively. I find something quietly fitting in that image. A historian finishing his life's final scholarly act, reaching for the same plain-spoken frontier poetry that had once accompanied a tin cup of Ariosa around a campfire 120 years earlier. The story of this coffee, it turns out, has a way of pulling people in completely. Researchers, restaurant owners, salesmen with family legends to chase professors who spend their final working hours making sure the record gets set down properly before they are gone. I want to ask you something because I think it gets at the heart of why this entire revival matters. Why does a defunct, decades-dead coffee brand from the 19th century deserve resurrection at all? There are, after all, thousands of failed companies from that era. Most of them stay failed, and rightly so. The market moved on for good reasons, and nostalgia alone is rarely sufficient grounds for bringing something back. I think the answer has something to do with what we have spent this entire story exploring together. Arbuckle's was never simply a commercial product. It was a daily ritual that meaningfully connected millions of ordinary people, cowboys, homesteaders, immigrant families in New York tenements, women managing weekly grocery budgets, to a small measure of reliability and comfort in lives that frequently offered very little of either. It solved a real physical daily problem with genuine ingenuity, and the people behind it, particularly John Arbuckle himself, built something with a level of integrity and human consideration that, frankly, very few corporate legacies from that ruthless era can genuinely claim. That kind of story does not simply disappear because a holding company absorbed the trademark into an unmarked filing cabinet in 1937. It waits. quietly in the legal record in old cowboy memoirs, in trade cards tucked away in family attics, in the simple fact that somewhere a man named Ken Arbuckle walked into a Pennsylvania restaurant supplier's office and mentioned his last name. And eventually, if the story's good enough, somebody notices and brings it back. We're nearly at the end of this journey together, from a Pittsburgh grocery counter in 1865 through patents and chuck wagons and sugar wars and floating hotels through a quiet death in Brooklyn in 1912, and a slow institutional fade through the 1920s, all the way to a small roasting operation in the Arizona desert that still every single day tucks a stick of peppermint candy into a 1-pound bag of coffee. There is one final question I want to leave you with before we close this chapter completely. It is the question that I think this entire story has been quietly building toward. From the very first image we shared together, that lone cowboy crouched by a campfire on the Texas plains, tearing open a brown paper package, what does it actually mean for something this small, this humble, this utterly ordinary, to leave a mark on history that outlasts the empire that built it? That is exactly where we are headed for the very last time right now. Tomorrow morning, somewhere around 66% of American adults are going to wake up, and within the first half hour or so of opening their eyes, reach for a cup of coffee. That is the highest percentage in 20 years according to the most recent national surveys, a steady climb that has been building for 2 decades, even as 1,000 other beverages have competed for that same morning ritual. The average American coffee drinker today gets through somewhere around 3 cups over the course of a day, and a meaningful, fast-growing share of those people are doing something that if you had described it to a cowboy on the Chisholm Trail in 1878 would have struck him as completely incomprehensible. They are seeking out coffee from a single-named farm in a single-named region, roasted by someone who can tell you the exact elevation the beans grew at, and the particular variety of cherry the farmer cultivated. Coffee professionals call this the third wave. Beans sourced not by country but by farm. Roasting designed to reveal a bean's particular character, rather than simply make it consistently drinkable. An entire culture built around the idea that where your coffee comes from and how carefully it was handled genuinely matters. And I find myself thinking every time I encounter this modern obsession with origin and craft and quality about a Pittsburgh grocer in 1865 staring at a sack of green coffee beans, refusing to accept that inconsistency was simply the price of doing business. The instinct has not changed at all, only the vocabulary has. We have spent a long evening together tracing one continuous thread through more than a century and a half of American life. A cowboy crouched by a campfire tearing open brown paper. A grocer's son in Pittsburgh refusing to believe that burnt coffee was simply how things had to be. A glaze made from egg whites and fish bladders that solved a problem nobody else had bothered to solve properly. A peppermint stick that turned a chore into a competition. A set of 50 lithographed cards that taught American children the flags of foreign nations, one coffee bag at a time. A 12-block industrial city on the Brooklyn waterfront with its own hospital and its own laundry and its own private railroad, built by a man who walked to work every single morning past the longshoremen he refused to look past. A multi-million-dollar war fought not for the sake of winning, but because an unfair price felt to one stubborn man like something worth $25 million to correct. A floating hotel with a piano on it anchored off the coast of a city that mostly chose not to notice its own poor. A breach of promise lawsuit that overshadowed 30 years of quiet essential work. A breathing mitten that never caught on. A farm in the Hudson Valley 1,200 acres wide, built for people the rest of the Gilded Age had simply decided not to think about. A final public crusade against a sugar tariff fought in the plainest words a tired, dying man could find, like taking candy from babies, and then the long quiet fade. A brand that proved it understood modern marketing perfectly in one triumphant campaign for Yuban, and then somehow never turned that same understanding back toward the very thing that had built the entire empire in the first place. A name that slipped slowly out of the American vocabulary across 2 decades until almost nobody under the age of 50 had ever heard it spoken aloud, and finally improbably a resurrection. Not orchestrated by a corporation or a marketing department, but by 2 restaurant owners in Pennsylvania who simply wanted reliable coffee for their customers, and a salesman with a family story worth chasing, and a professor who spent his final hours on this earth making sure the record got set down properly before it was too late. If there is one thread running underneath every single chapter of this story, and I've thought about this a great deal while putting tonight's journey together for you, it is this. Ordinary things carry more history than we tend to give them credit for. We walk past coffee every single day of our lives. We do not think about it the way we think about wars or elections or the great monuments of human achievement. It is simply there in the kitchen, in the office break room, in the paper cup we carry, without a second thought on our way somewhere more important. And yet when you actually trace its path backward, carefully, patiently, the way we have done together tonight, you find an entire civilization hiding inside it. You find immigration and ambition and grief and stubbornness and kindness and greed, and ultimately a kind of redemption that nobody could have planned for in advance. John Arbuckle did not set out to become a symbol of anything. He set out to fix a sack of badly roasted coffee beans in a Pittsburgh warehouse because the inconsistency of it genuinely bothered him, and because he was the kind of person who could not simply walk past a broken thing without trying to repair it. Everything else, the patents, the empire, the floating hotels, the wars with monopolists, the farm for disabled workers, the mitten. Nobody wanted, all of it grew almost organically from that same single instinct applied again and again for 50 years to whatever problem happened to be standing in front of him next. That is, I think, as close to a genuine definition of a meaningful life as I've encountered in any of the stories I've brought you. Not grand vision pursued from the very beginning, just a refusal to accept that things had to stay broken applied with total consistency for as long as the body allowed it. So the next time you find yourself standing in your own kitchen in the quiet hour before the rest of your household wakes up waiting for that first cup to finish brewing, I hope you will think just for a moment about everything that small ritual is actually carrying. A patent from 1868 written in language about isinglass and Irish moss that nobody uses anymore. A cowboy somewhere on the Chisholm Trail calling out into the dark for whoever wants the candy. A man walking to work past the longshoremen refusing to walk past them the way wealth so often teaches people to do. A peppermint stick still even now tucked into certain bags of coffee by a family in the Arizona desert who simply decided that a story this good deserved to keep being told. It is in the end just coffee. I understand that. It is not meant to carry the weight of an entire civilization on every single morning you reach for it. But I happen to think that the very best stories are the ones hiding inside the things we've stopped noticing entirely. The objects so woven into the ordinary texture of our lives that we forgot somewhere along the way that they were ever extraordinary to begin with. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with me tonight. If you have made it all the way to this final moment through every chapter of this long and winding story, I genuinely hope it gave you something, a little bit of wonder, a little bit of rest, perhaps, even a small renewed appreciation for whatever quiet ritual happens to start your own mornings. That is more than anything else what I hope these evenings together can offer you. There is another story already waiting, gathering itself in the quiet hours, ready to be told the next time you turn the lights down low and settle in for the night. Another ordinary object, another forgotten name, another thread of history hiding in plain sight somewhere in the world around you. Until then, rest well, sleep deeply, and let tonight's story settle quietly into your dreams,